The gunshot tore through the winter silence like a blade. Silas Sullivan bolted upright in his bed, the chill air of the cabin rushing against his skin as the blanket fell away. His hand moved by instinct, reaching for the Winchester rifle propped against the bedpost before his eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness. 5 years removed from war, and still his body remembered the rapid shift from sleep to survival. He listened. Nothing but the hollow moan of wind threading through pine boughs and the subtle creak of his cabin settling against the cold. Then he heard it again, not a gunshot he realized, but the sharp crack of wood breaking. Someone or something was at his food store. Silas pulled on his boots without lacing them and shrugged into his coat, the wool still holding yesterday's cold. The rifle felt familiar in his grip as he eased the cabin door open, wincing at its betraying groan. Outside, the Texas winter had painted everything in silver and shadow. Moonlight caught on snow crystals, turning the clearing around his cabin into a sea of dim light. His breath clouded before him as he followed the tracks leading to the small shed where he kept his smoked meat and preserved vegetables. The door hung partially open, its simple wooden latch splintered. Silas raised his rifle, squinting against the darkness within. "Step out slow," he called, his voice rough from disuse. "Vamos. I've got no quarrel with you, but I'll shoot if I have to." A sound came from inside, not the shuffle of human feet, but something softer. Silas reached into his pocket for a match, struck it against the doorframe, and held the small flame forward. In the flickering light, he saw not a desperate drifter or bandit, but a young deer scarcely more than a fawn. It cowered in the corner of the shed, dark eyes reflecting the matchlight, a thin trail of blood marking its path from a gash on its flank. Likely escaped from a wolf or mountain lion driven by terror and hunger to seek shelter in the only human structure for miles. Silas lowered his rifle. He watched the creature tremble, its breath coming in rapid, shallow pants that mirrored his own first moments of wakefulness. "Well now," he murmured, setting his rifle against the outer wall. "Seems we both got startled for nothing." He moved slowly back to the cabin and returned with a lantern, a clean cloth, and what remained of a bottle of whiskey. The deer tried to press further into the corner as he approached, but had nowhere left to retreat. "Easy," Silas said, crouching down. "This'll sting, but it's better than festering." With practiced hands, he cleaned the wound, a long but shallow tear that would heal if infection didn't set in. The deer flinched, but didn't bolt, either too weak or somehow sensing his intent was not to harm. When he finished, Silas placed a handful of dried apples on the floor of the shed, then backed away. "This world's taken enough," he said quietly to the watching creature. "I don't need to take more." He repaired the latch well enough to keep out predators, but left it loose so the deer could push its way out when it was ready. As he turned back toward his cabin, the eastern sky had just begun to lighten, a thin gray line pushing against the darkness. Too awake now to return to sleep, Silas resigned himself to starting the day early. The cabin that Silas Sullivan called home stood at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by tall pines that shielded it from the worst of the wind. It was neither large nor particularly well crafted. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn log walls chinked with moss and clay, and a roof that managed to keep out most of the rain, but occasionally surrendered to the persistence of snow. Yet every beam, every stone, every nail had been placed by his own hands over the course of a bitter autumn 5 years ago, when work had been the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Inside the furnishings were sparse a bed, pushed against the wall, furthest from the door, a table with 2 chairs. Though he had never had a visitor, a chest for his few clothes and shelves holding the practical necessities of a solitary life. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean, a kettle hanging ready above the banked coals from the previous night's fire. Silas moved with the efficiency of long routine, stoking the fire with practiced motions. He filled the kettle with water from the bucket by the door and set coffee to brew, his one luxury purchased on rare trips to the settlement 15 miles south. While the water heated, he washed his face in the basin, the cold water shocking away the last vestiges of sleep. The man who stared back at him from the small mirror nailed to the wall was a stranger to the one who had ridden with the Union Army 12 years ago. His once dark hair now threaded with gray at the temples, his face weathered by sun, and wind lines etched deeply around eyes that had seen too much. He had been handsome once, Margaret used to say, in the way of men who carried themselves with quiet confidence rather than swagger. He wondered what she would think of him now with his untrimmed beard and the permanent furrow between his brows. Probably she would have smoothed it with her thumb the way she used to when he came home troubled from his scouting missions during the war. But Margaret was gone, just as their unborn child was gone, just as the future they had planned together was gone, all of it reduced to ash and memory in a fire that had taken only minutes to devour their small home near the railway office where he had worked 5 years ago today. Silas poured his coffee and stepped out onto the small porch despite the biting cold. The first rays of sun were just breaking through the pines, turning the snow-covered ground into a sea of diamonds. This had been his ritual since that first year to greet the dawn on this dark anniversary, to remind himself that the world continued to turn regardless of what it had taken from him. From the pocket of his coat, he withdrew a small piece of embroidered cloth, carefully unfolding it with calloused fingers. It was the beginnings of a sampler that Margaret had been working on before she died. The words "our home" only half completed the thread, trailing off mid-letter, where she had set it down for the last time. Somehow it had survived the fire, protected in a metal sewing box that he had later found in the ruins. He had carried it with him ever since, a tangible reminder of all he had lost. 1,826 days, he whispered, his breath clouding in the winter air. 5 years doesn't get any easier, Maggie. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow. Silas remained on the porch until his coffee grew cold, then carefully refolded the sampler and returned it to his pocket close to his heart. There was work to be done, wood to chop, traps to check, the small routines that filled his days, and if he was fortunate, left him too tired to dream at night. He gathered his gear, the axe for wood, the knife at his belt, snares for rabbits, and the rifle slung across his back. The day stretched before him, indistinguishable from the hundreds that had come before it, yet another step away from the life he had once known, and toward nothing in particular. Just existence stripped down to its barest elements. The forest received him as it always did, indifferent to his presence, yet somehow welcoming in its constancy. Here at least the rules were simple. Survive. Be aware. Take only what you need. The complexities of the world beyond these trees, the greed of men like William Hargrove and his railroad company, the bitter divisions still lingering from the war, the relentless push westward that crushed everything in its path, all of it fell away under the silent watch of ancient pines. Silas moved through the woods with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude. He checked his trap lines, first finding a single rabbit that he quickly dispatched with a practiced hand. After resetting the snares, he continued deeper into the forest toward a stand of dead trees that would provide dry wood for his fire. The physical labor of chopping was a welcome distraction, the rhythmic swing of the axe and the satisfying crack of splitting wood filling his mind with blessed emptiness. By midday, he had accumulated a decent pile of firewood, which he bound together with rope to drag back to the cabin. The temperature had risen slightly enough that the snow underfoot had become heavy and wet, clinging to his boots and making the journey back more strenuous than the trip out had been. Silas welcomed the exertion, anything to ensure he would sleep without dreams tonight. He was halfway home when he noticed the tracks, a single line cutting across his own path from earlier that morning. Human tracks, not animal. Small and light, but definitely a person on foot moving with purpose toward the eastern ridge. Silas frowned. Few people ventured this far from the settlement, especially in winter. Trappers occasionally passed through, but they generally kept to the valleys where game was more plentiful. Curiosity piqued, Silas left his wood bundle tied to a tree and followed the tracks. They led him along a game trail he rarely used, winding through a dense thicket of younger pines before emerging near the base of a rocky outcropping that local settlers called the Devil's Backbone, a jagged line of stone that resembled a spine protruding from the earth. The tracks continued up along a narrow path that skirted the rocks. Silas hesitated. Whoever had made these tracks was heading into some of the most inhospitable terrain in the area. If they were lost or injured, he shook his head. It wasn't his concern. He had spent 5 years minding his own business, staying clear of other people's troubles. That was how he had survived. Yet something, perhaps the date, perhaps the memory of Margaret's gentle insistence that a man's worth was measured by what he did for others, compelled him forward. He would follow just long enough to ensure the traveler wasn't in distress, then return to his own path. The tracks led him higher to a small plateau sheltered by the curve of the ridge. There, partially hidden among a cluster of boulders, he found not the lost hunter or prospector he had expected, but an elderly native woman. She lay motionless in the snow, her dark skin ashen, her silver-streaked hair bound in two long braids that contrasted starkly against the white ground. She wore a mixture of traditional clothing and cast-off European garments, a deerskin dress beneath a tattered wool coat that was far too thin for the winter cold. Beside her lay a small bundle of possessions wrapped in a faded blanket. Silas approached cautiously, unsure if he was looking at a dying woman or one already dead. He knelt beside her, noting the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Still alive then, but barely. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her fingers swollen and discolored from the cold. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Can you hear me?" For a moment there was no response. Then her eyes opened dark, deep, and startlingly clear, despite her obvious distress. She looked at him with none of the confusion or fear he might have expected, but rather with a strange intensity, as if she had been waiting for him specifically. Her hands shot out with surprising strength, grasping his wrist. Her voice, when it came, was raspy but distinct, and her English carried only the slightest accent. "At last you have come, fire and ash, the man who lives between two worlds." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. How could this woman, a stranger, know about the fire, and what did she mean about two worlds? He tried to pull away, but her grip remained firm. "You're confused, ma'am," he said. "You need help. Let me get you somewhere warm." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "I am Tallulah. I have been waiting. The vision said you would come on this day." Silas had encountered native Bao'lis before during the war and in his time with the railroad. He didn't share them, but he respected the conviction with which they were held. This woman, Tallulah, clearly believed what she was saying, delirious though it might be. "I'm going to help you up," he said, choosing to ignore her strange words. "My cabin's not far. Can you walk if I support you?" Tallulah nodded once, releasing his wrist. As Silas helped her to her feet, he was struck by how light she was, all bone and sinew beneath the layers of clothing, as if she had been surviving on little more than will for some time. She leaned heavily against him, but managed to stay upright. "Your bundle," he said, gesturing to her belongings. "Leave it," she replied. "She will bring it." "She bet." Silas glanced around, seeing no one else. Tallulah didn't elaborate and Silas didn't press. The woman was clearly not in her right mind, and his priority was getting her somewhere warm before the cold claimed another life on this already somber day. The journey back to the cabin was slow and arduous. Tallulah walked with determination but little strength, and twice they had to stop for her to rest. Silas found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in years, where his cabin was, how he had built it himself, how he had a fire going that would warm her quickly. Simple, practical information, yet more words than he typically uttered in a week of solitude. As they neared the clearing, Tallulah seemed to gather herself, standing a bit straighter. "Your deer is gone," she said. Silas looked at her sharply. "What deer?" "The one you helped this morning. It has gone back to its mother." He hadn't mentioned the deer to her. There was no way she could have known about it unless she had been watching him. The thought was unsettling. "How do you know about that?" he asked. Tallulah's expression remained impassive. "I know many things, Silas Sullivan." He hadn't told her his name either. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the snow. Silas helped Tallulah inside and settled her in the chair closest to the fire, which had burned low in his absence. He quickly added wood and stoked it back to life, the flames casting a warm glow across the small space. "I'll make you something hot to drink," he said, filling the kettle with the fresh water. "And there's rabbit stew from yesterday." Tallulah nodded, extending her hands toward the fire. "You have lived alone a long time," she observed, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings of the cabin. "I prefer it that way," Silas replied more curtly than he had intended. "No," she said, "you do not prefer it. You endure it. There is a difference." Silas busied himself with preparing the tea. Uncomfortable with how easily this stranger had seen through the fiction, he told himself. When he turned back, Tallulah was examining something she had removed from the pocket of her coat, a small leather pouch from which she withdrew what appeared to be a mixture of dried herbs. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the kettle. Silas hesitated, then nodded. She added a pinch of the herbs to the boiling water, and almost immediately a pleasant, earthy aroma filled the cabin. "For strength," she explained. and to clear the mind. While the tea steeped, Silas reheated the stew, aware of Tallulah's steady gaze following his movements. There was something unnerving about her calm certainty, as if she were exactly where she had intended to be all along. "You should be more careful," he said, eventually setting a bowl of stew before her. "Another hour out there, and you might not have made it." "I was not concerned," Tallulah replied, accepting the food with a nod of thanks. "The vision showed that you would find me." Silas sighed. "Look, I don't know what visions you're talking about, but I only found you because I happened to see your tracks." "There are no accidents, Silas Sullivan. Only patterns we do not yet understand." He didn't argue further, instead watching as she ate with slow deliberation, savoring each spoonful as if it were a rare delicacy rather than simple trail food. When she had finished, he poured her a cup of the herb-infused tea, then one for himself. It tasted better than he had expected, a hint of sweetness beneath the earthiness warming him from within. "Thank you," Tallulah said, cradling the cup in her hands. "It has been some time since I enjoyed such hospitality." "Where are you from?" Silas asked. "Your people, I mean." "My mother's people were Apache. My father was Comanche." She gestured vaguely eastward. "Our band moved often, following the old ways as best we could, while the white man's world closed in around us. But that life is gone now. And you're out here alone in winter." Tallulah's expression shifted subtly. "Not alone. My daughter travels with me." Silas straightened. "Your daughter, where is she?" "Watching, waiting. She does not trust easily." Tallulah's gaze moved to the window where darkness had now fallen completely. "She has been following you for many days, learning your routines, your habits." An uncomfortable prickle ran down Silas's spine. "Following me, why?" "Because I told her we must find the man who lives between two worlds, the man touched by fire and ash." Tallulah set down her cup. "She has been searching for you for 3 winters." Silas stood abruptly, moving to the window. He peered out into the darkness, seeing nothing but his own reflection against the night. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. "I don't know you or your daughter, and I don't appreciate being followed." "Yet you brought me to your home," Tallulah observed. "A man who truly wishes to be left alone would have passed by." She had him there. Silas turned back, studying the old woman with newfound wariness. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you are not already prepared to give," Tallulah replied cryptically. She closed her eyes briefly, a look of pain crossing her features. "I am tired now. May I rest?" Despite his unease, Silas couldn't bring himself to turn the woman out into the cold night. "Take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." "Thank you." Tallulah rose shakily to her feet. "Do not fear my daughter when she comes. She means you no harm." "When will that be?" "Soon." Tallulah made her way to the bed, moving with the careful precision of one accustomed to managing pain. "She has seen enough to know you are the one." "And the one what?" But Tallulah had already laid down, pulling the single blanket up to her chin. Within moments, her breathing had deepened into sleep, leaving Silas alone with his questions, and a growing sense that the solitude he had so carefully constructed was about to be irrevocably shattered. He remained by the window for a long time, scanning the edge of the clearing for any sign of movement. The moon had risen, casting enough light to distinguish the dark line of trees from the open snow, but revealing nothing unusual. Eventually, he returned to the fire, adding another log, before settling into the chair Tallulah had vacated. Sleep eluded him, his mind too full of the day's strange turn. He found himself repeatedly reaching for the piece of embroidery in his pocket, running his thumb over the half-finished letters, as if they might somehow offer guidance. Margaret would have known what to make of Tallulah's appearance and cryptic words. She had possessed an intuition about people that he had always lacked, and able to sense intentions and needs that remained invisible to him. "What would you do, Maggie?" he whispered, the question dissipating in the quiet cabin. The fire popped in response, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Silas watched them rise and fade like brief, brilliant lives against the darkness. Eventually, his eyes grew heavy, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep, still clutching the samplers in his hand. He dreamed of the fire, not an unusual occurrence on this night of all nights, but this time it was different. Instead of the helpless horror of watching his home burn with Margaret inside, he saw himself walking through the flames unharmed. Margaret stood at the center of the inferno, her belly rounded with their child, her face serene despite the destruction around them. "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice clear above the roar of the fire. "It was never your fault." Before he could reach her, the scene shifted. He was standing in a forest clearing surrounded by towering pines. A young native woman stood before him, her face in shadow, a single eagle feather woven into her dark hair. Behind her, a small child played in the snow, laughing with innocent delight. "She needs you." Margaret's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "And you need her." Silas jerked awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in a dim red glow. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why he was sleeping in a chair. Then his eyes fell on the figure in his bed, Tallulah still sleeping soundly, and the events of the day came rushing back. He rose stiffly, his joints protesting the awkward position he had maintained in sleep. The air in the cabin had grown cold, and he moved quietly to add more wood to the fire. As he knelt by the hearth, a soft sound from outside caught his attention, the deliberate crunch of footsteps in snow. Silas reached for his rifle, which he had propped against the wall by the door. Tallulah's words echoed in his mind, "Do not fear my daughter when she comes." Still, years of solitude had taught him caution. He moved to the window, peering out into the pre-dawn gray. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a woman tall and straight-backed despite the bundle she carried. She made no attempt to conceal herself, standing motionless in the open, as if waiting to be acknowledged. Silas hesitated, his hand still on the rifle. Then, decision made, he set it aside and opened the door. "You might as well come in," he called, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Your mother's inside." The woman didn't move immediately. She stood watching him for several long seconds, assessing. Then, with a deliberate grace that spoke of strength and caution in equal measure, she began to cross the clearing toward the cabin. As she drew closer, Silas could make out her features in the growing light. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her mid-20s, with a face that combined delicate beauty and unmistakable resolve. Her clothing was a practical blend of native and settler garments, a deerskin dress worn under a man's wool coat that was several sizes too large for her leggings, and sturdy moccasins that made little sound even on the crusted snow. Her hair was bound in a single braid that hung down her back, the eagle feather from his dream secured at its base. She carried Tallulah's bundle, along with what appeared to be a hunting bow and a small quiver of arrows. Her dark eyes never left his face as she approached, studying him with the same intensity her mother had shown. "Ayana," she said simply when she reached the porch, touching her chest. Her voice was low and melodious, her English as fluent as her mother's. "You are Silas Sullivan." It wasn't a question. Silas nodded, stepping aside to let her enter the cabin. "Your mother is sleeping," he said. "She was in bad shape when I found her." Ayana paused at the threshold, her gaze sweeping the interior of the cabin in a quick assessment before settling on the sleeping form of Tallulah. Something like relief crossed her features, though her overall expression remained guarded. "Thank you for helping her," she said, entering with quiet steps. She set down her burdens near the door, removing the bow and quiver, last her movement suggesting reluctance to be parted from them, even briefly. "She said you have been following me," Silas said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Tallulah. "For 3 winters," Ayana regarded him steadily. "Yes." "Why?" "She believes you are the one from her vision." Ayana glanced at her mother. "She has been searching since the dream came to her." "What dream? What vision?" Silas's frustration edged into his voice. "I've never met either of you before yesterday." "No," Ayana agreed, "but she has met you in the spirit world. She saw your fire." Silas ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "Look, I don't know what your mother thinks she saw, but I'm just a man who wants to be left alone. I helped her because anyone would. That's all." A ghost of a smile touched Ayana's lips. "Not anyone. Many would have passed by. Some would have taken advantage." She moved to her mother's side, placing a gentle hand on the older woman's forehead. "She has fever." The abrupt change of subject caught Silas off guard. He moved closer, noticing for the first time the unnatural flush to Tallulah's cheeks and the rapid rise and fall of her chest. "She seemed weak yesterday, but I thought it was just the cold and hunger," he said. Ayana's expression darkened. "She has been sick for many weeks. It is why we had to leave our winter camp." She straightened. "I need clean water and cloth. And if you have any whiskey, that too." Silas found himself responding to the authority in her voice without question, gathering the requested items, while Ayana gently roused her mother. Tallulah's eyes opened, focusing immediately on her daughter. "You came she said, her voice weaker than it had been the previous evening. Of course I came, Ayana replied in Apache, the syllables flowing softly between them. I told you to wait for me at the rocks. There was no time, Tallulah answered in the same language. The snow was coming, and the vision was clear. Today was the day he would find me. Silas, returning with the supplies, paused at the foreign exchange. Though he couldn't understand the words, the concern in Ayana's voice was unmistakable. Is there anything else you need? He asked, setting down the watercloth and half-empty bottle of whiskey. Ayana switched back to English smoothly. These will do for now. Thank you. She set about tending to her mother with practiced efficiency, bathing her face and neck with the cool water, then helping her drink a small amount mixed with whiskey. Throughout, she spoke softly in Apache words of comfort or instruction that Silas could only guess at. He busied himself with building up the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of his molasses. The domestic activity felt strange after so long alone, the cabin suddenly too small with the addition of two others. When he turned back, Ayana was helping Tallulah sit up against the wall, propping her with a single pillow from his bed. The older woman looked even more frail in the full light of day, her skin drawn tight over high cheekbones, her eyes bright with fever. She needs to eat, Ayana said, accepting the bowl Silas offered. And then rest. The journey was too much for her. You're welcome to stay until she's stronger, Silas found himself saying, though the words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Ayana. Winter's no time to be traveling, especially with someone sick. Ayana studied him for a long moment, as if trying to discern his motives. Why would you offer this? You said yourself you wished to be alone. Silas couldn't explain the impulse himself. Perhaps it was the date making him more susceptible to ghosts and memories. Perhaps it was the strange dreams still vivid in his mind. Or perhaps it was simply that after 5 years of solitude, some buried part of him remembered what it was to be human among humans. It's the right thing to do, he said finally. That's all. Ayana seemed to accept this, nodding once. We accept your hospitality then, until my mother is well enough to travel. Oh, and as she turned her attention back to helping Tallulah eat, Silas found himself watching the interaction between mother and daughter. There was a tenderness in Ayana's movements that belied her otherwise reserved demeanor, a softening around her eyes when she looked at the older woman. It reminded him of the way Margaret had cared for her aging father in his final illness, practical yet gentle, firm yet kind. The comparison brought an unexpected pang. It had been months since he had allowed himself to think of Margaret as she had been in life rather than as she had died. The memories were still painful, but there was something almost sweet in recalling her goodness rather than only her loss. Ayana glanced up, catching him watching. For a moment, their eyes met in a look of mutual recognition, two people who understood the weight of responsibility for another's well-being. Then she returned her attention to Tallulah, and Silas turned away, oddly discomfited by the brief connection. I need to check my traps, he said, reaching for his coat, and collect the firewood I left in the forest yesterday. I'll be back before midday. Ayana nodded without looking up. We will be here. Outside, the morning had bloomed clear and cold, the sky a deep, unbroken blue above the pines. Silas paused on the porch, breathing deeply of the crisp air, trying to clear his head of the strange thoughts and feelings that had surfaced since finding Tallulah the day before. He had lived 5 years in carefully constructed isolation, his days measured in practical tasks and his nights in dreamless exhaustion. Now, in the space of less than a day, that carefully maintained balance had been disrupted by an old woman's cryptic words and her daughter's watchful eyes. What are you doing, Sullivan? He muttered to himself as he set off toward the place he had left his bundled firewood. This isn't your concern. Yet even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. For better or worse, Tallulah and Ayana had entered his life, and something told him they wouldn't be leaving it unchanged. The morning passed quickly as Silas attended to his neglected tasks from the previous day. He retrieved the firewood first, the physical exertion of dragging it back to the cabin, helping to settle his troubled thoughts. Then he checked his trap lines, finding 2 more rabbits and a plump squirrel that would make a good stew. On the way back, he took a detour to a small stream that hadn't yet frozen completely, breaking through the ice to fill his canteen with fresh water. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the strange circumstances that had brought Tallulah and Ayana to his cabin. Their story made no sense, visions, 3 winters of searching, cryptic references to fire and ash, and the man who lives between 2 worlds. Yet there was a conviction in both women that was difficult to dismiss as mere delusion. And then there was the dream, Margaret telling him it wasn't his fault, the native woman, with the eagle feather, the laughing child. It had been so vivid, so unlike his usual nightmares of helplessness and loss. What had Tallulah put in that tea? By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had reached its zenith, casting short shadows across the snow. As he approached, he noticed that the snow around the porch had been swept clear, and a thin curl of smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Someone, Ayanna, presumably had been tending the fire in his absence. He paused at the edge of the clearing, suddenly aware that he was returning not to an empty cabin, but to a place where others waited. It was a feeling both foreign and achingly familiar, stirring memories of another life when coming home had meant more than simply seeking shelter. With a shake of his head, Silas pushed the thought away and continued forward. This was temporary, he reminded himself. A few days of hospitality until Tallulah was well enough to travel, nothing more. As he neared the cabin, the door opened and Ayanna stepped out. She had removed the oversized coat, revealing the deerskin dress beneath. It was finely made, decorated with intricate beadwork across the bodice and along the hem, though signs of wear showed at the edges and seams. Her hair remained in its single braid, but she had added a second feather, this one smaller, possibly from a hawk, alongside the eagle feather from before. "You return with meat," she observed, eyeing the game tied to his belt. "Good. My mother needs strength." "How is she?" Silas asked, climbing the steps to the porch. "The fever rises and falls. She sleeps now." Ayanna held out her hands. "I will prepare the meal if you wish." Silas hesitated. In 5 years, no one else had cooked in his cabin or used his few utensils. It felt oddly intimate to hand over this simple task. "I can manage," he said. Ayanna lowered her hands, her expression unchanging. "As you wish." She remained on the porch as he entered the cabin, the warmth inside a welcome contrast to the winter chill. Tallulah lay sleeping on the bed, her face still flushed with fever, but her breathing deeper and more regular than earlier. Someone, Ayanna again, had placed a damp cloth on her forehead. Silas set about preparing the rabbits and squirrel burgers stew, working quietly to avoid disturbing Tallulah. As he was finishing, Ayanna re-entered the cabin, bringing with her a breath of cold air and the scent of pine. "There is more snow coming," she said, moving to check on her mother. "By nightfall." Silas glanced toward the window. The sky remained clear from what he could see, but he had learned long ago to respect the weather sense of those who lived closer to the land than most. "We have enough wood," he said, "and food now. We'll be fine." Ayanna nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response. She watched as he added the meat to the pot, already simmering with vegetables preserved from his small garden's autumn harvest. "You live well," she observed, "for a man alone." "I manage." Silas stirred the stew, keeping his eyes on the task. "Been on my own a long time." 5 years, Ayanna said. "Since the fire." Silas's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. He turned slowly to face her. "What do you know about that?" Ayanna met his gaze steadily. "My mother sees things in dreams. She saw your fire the night it happened. She saw your wife." A cold weight settled in Silas's stomach. "That's not possible." "Yet she knows of it." Ayanna's voice remained calm, matter-of-fact. "As she knows your name and this place and that you would find her yesterday." "Coincidence," Silas said, though the word felt hollow even as he spoke it. "Or you've been asking questions about me in the settlement." "We have never been to your settlement." Ayanna glanced at her mother. "She believes your wife's spirit reached out to her that night. That is why we have been searching for you." Silas set down the spoon with more force than necessary, anger rising hot and sudden in his chest. "That's enough. I don't know what game you're playing, but Margaret is dead. She died in that fire. She's not reaching out to anyone, and she sure as hell didn't send you to find me." Ayanna didn't flinch at his outburst. "You do not have to believe. It changes nothing." "It changes everything," Silas snapped. "You're in my home because I offered help to a sick woman, not because of some superstition about my dead wife." "Then why did you dream of her last night?" Ayanna asked quietly. "And of me with the eagle feather." Silas stared at her, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "How do you know what I dreamed?" "My mother heard you speak in your sleep. You said Maggie and eagle feather and child." Ayanna touched the feather in her hair. "I have worn this since my father died. It was his." The anger drained from Silas as quickly as it had come, leaving him unsettled and vaguely afraid. "This is crazy," he muttered, more to himself than to Ayanna. Perhaps, she agreed, or perhaps there are things in this world beyond what you have allowed yourself to believe. Before Silas could respond, Tallulah stirred on the bed, murmuring something in Apache. Ayanna immediately went to her side, helping her sit up and offering water from the cup on the nearby table. Silas turned back to the stew, grateful for the interruption. His mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts and emotions, anger at what felt like an invasion of his privacy, and grief. Skepticism at the impossible claims, and beneath it all, a tiny, unwelcome spark of something that might have been hope. He pushed it all aside, focusing on the practical task before him. The stew needed salt, and the fire needed tending, and these women needed food and shelter until the old one was well enough to move on. That was all that mattered, not visions or dreams, or the unsettling feeling that his carefully constructed solitude was crumbling around him. As evening approached, the sky darkened with the promised snow. Silas had spent the afternoon splitting more firewood, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the strange conversation with Ayanna. By the time he finished, the first flakes were beginning to fall, large, lazy crystals that drifted down in a deceptively gentle prelude to what his aching joints told him would be a significant storm. Inside, he found Ayanna sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fire, sewing something with neat practice stitches. Tallulah remained on the bed, propped up with the pillow, her eyes closed but her breathing indicating she was awake. "Storm's coming," Silas said, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. "Might be a heavy one." Ayanna nodded without looking up from her work. "3 days," she said. "We will be here 3 days before it passes." Silas raised an eyebrow. "That's specific." "My mother sees it." Ayanna tied off her thread and bit it with her teeth. "She sees many things." Silas glanced at Tallulah, who had opened her eyes at the sound of their voices. The fever seemed to have receded somewhat, leaving her looking exhausted but more present than she had been earlier. "The stew should be ready," he said, moving to check the pot hanging over the fire. "You both should eat." "You are kind, Silas Sullivan," Tallulah said, her voice stronger than it had been that morning, "despite your desire not to be." Silas ignored the comment, ladling stew into 3 bowls. He handed one to Ayanna, then brought another to Tallulah, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You should know," he said, returning to his own bowl. "Once the storm passes and you're well enough, you'll need to move on. I meant what I said about preferring to be alone." "Of course," Tallulah agreed, though something in her tone suggested she didn't believe in him. "We have imposed enough on your hospitality." They ate in silence for a time, the only sounds the soft clink of spoons against bowls and the increasing moan of wind around the cabin's eaves. The stew was good, rich, with meat and root vegetables, seasoned with the few herbs Silas had managed to dry before winter set in. "You cook well," Ayanna observed, breaking the silence. "Most men do not." "Necessity," Silas replied with a shrug. "Can't live on jerky and hardtack forever." "Still, it is a skill many lack." She finished her bowl and set it aside. "Tomorrow I will cook, to repay your kindness." Before Silas could protest, Tallulah spoke. "My daughter learned from the mission women. She makes bread that would make your Eastern ladies jealous." "Mission women?" Silas looked at Ayanna with renewed curiosity. Ayanna's expression remained neutral, but something in her posture suggested discomfort with the topic. "I spent some years at the mission school near Fort Davis," she said, "before returning to my people." "That explains your English," Silas noted, "and your mother's." "I taught her when I returned," Ayanna said. "She believed it was important to understand the language of those who now controlled our lands." "Wise woman." "Yes," Ayanna stood collecting the empty bowls. "She is very wise. You would do well to listen to what she has to say." With that, she moved to the basin of water Silas kept for washing, effectively ending the conversation. Silas watched her for a moment, struck by the grace with which she moved, even in such mundane tasks. There was a quiet dignity to her that reminded him oddly of the deer he had found that morning, wary but proud, wounded but unbowed. He turned his attention to Tallulah, who was watching him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "Your daughter said you've been searching for me for 3 winters," he said, keeping his voice low. "Why, Kai?" Tallulah's gaze never wavered. "Because you need us as much as we need you, Silas Sullivan, though you do not yet know it." "And what exactly is it you think I need?" "To live again," Tallulah said simply, "not merely exist." The words struck closer to home than Silas cared to admit. He looked away, uncomfortable with the old woman's insight. "I'm doing fine," he said. "No," Tallulah replied. "You are surviving, There is a difference. Before he could respond, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the cabin's shutters, drawing his attention to the window. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, driven sideways by the strengthening wind. The storm had arrived in earnest. "It's going to be a long night," he said, rising to add more wood to the fire. "We should all get some rest." He arranged a makeshift bed for himself near the hearth, using his coat as a pillow and a spare blanket he normally used only in the deepest cold. Ayanna, having finished with the dishes, spread her own bedroll on the floor beside her mother's bed. As Silas settled in for the night, he was acutely aware of the sounds of others breathing in his space, soft, rhythmic reminders that he was no longer alone. It was both comforting and deeply unsettling, like revisiting a once familiar place only to find it subtly changed. The wind continued to howl outside, pushing snow against the cabin walls and down the chimney to hiss in the flames. Silas lay awake, staring at the dancing shadows on the ceiling, Tallulah's words echoing in his mind. "You are surviving. There is a difference, Rabbi." Was there he had built this life with his own hands after losing everything. He had found a way to continue when continuing seemed impossible. Wasn't that living? Yet as he listened to the steady breathing of the two women, one aged and ill, but unwavering in her purpose, the other young and strong, devoted to her mother's care, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. When was the last time he had felt purpose beyond mere existence? When had he last done something that mattered to anyone but himself? 5 years. 5 long years of days bleeding into one another, of seasons changing, while he remained static, of a world moving forward, while he stood still in the shadow of his loss. Silas turned onto his side, facing the fire. The flames had died down to a steady glow, neither rising nor falling, just enduring, like him. "Surviving," he whispered to himself, "not living." And the admission, even spoken to no one but himself, felt like the breaking of something long calcified within him, painful yet somehow necessary, like the setting of a bone that had healed wrong. Outside, the storm raged on, blanketing the world in white, erasing tracks and boundaries and familiar landmarks. By morning, everything would look different, transformed by forces beyond human control into something new and uncharted. As Silas finally drifted towards sleep, he wondered if perhaps the same was happening to him, if the arrival of these strange women, with their talk of visions and spirits, was a storm of another kind, one that would leave him irrevocably changed when it finally passed. His last conscious thought was of Margaret, not as she had been in death, consumed by fire, but as she had been in life, laughing in the spring sunshine, her hand resting protectively over the swell of their unborn child. For the first time in 5 years, the memory brought not only pain, but also a bittersweet warmth, like the ghost of a touch long forgotten. "Maggie," he murmured, sleep finally claiming him. "What am I supposed to do?" In his dreams, she smiled and pointed toward the east, where the sun would eventually rise, melting the snow and revealing what lay beneath. Silas woke to a cabin transformed by the soft gray light of a snow-muffled dawn. For a moment, he remained still, disoriented by the unfamiliar angle of the ceiling above him and the persistent ache in his back from sleeping on the floor. Then the events of the previous day rushed back to Lula in the snow, Ayanna appearing at his door, the storm that had sealed the three of them inside his small cabin. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb the women. Tallulah remained on his bed, her silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders, her breathing deep and even. The fever seemed to have broken during the night, bringing a healthier color to her weathered face. On the floor beside the bed, Ayanna slept curled on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the other resting near her mother as if maintaining contact even in sleep. The eagle feather remained woven into her braid, a splash of darkness against the lighter tones of the blanket. Moving with the silent precision developed over years of hunting, Silas stoked the banked embers in the fireplace and added fresh wood. The flames caught quickly, dispelling some of the morning chill. He filled the kettle with water for coffee, then moved to the window to assess the storm's damage. Outside, the world had been erased and rewritten in pristine white. Snow had drifted nearly to the windowsill, and beyond the glass he could see only the vague outlines of the nearest trees, their branches heavy with fresh powder. The sky above remained leaden, promising more snow before the day was through. Ayanna's prediction of 3 days' confinement suddenly seemed not only plausible but conservative. A soft rustle of movement drew his attention back to the interior of the cabin. Ayanna had risen and was now kneeling beside her mother, checking her temperature with a gentle touch to the forehead. Their eyes met across the room and she gave a small nod. Tallulah was better. Coffee, Silas offered, keeping his voice low. Please, Ayana replied, equally quiet. She rose and crossed to the wash basin, splashing cold water on her face before binding her hair more securely. Silas busied himself with the familiar ritual of brewing coffee, grateful for the routine in the midst of such unfamiliar circumstances. When it was ready, he poured 2 cups and handed one to Ayana, who accepted it with a murmured thanks. They stood in silence for a time, sipping the strong black liquid and watching the fires dance. It was an oddly comfortable silence, like that of people long accustomed to each other's presence. The thought unsettled Silas how quickly the shape of his solitude had accommodated these strangers. The storm has settled into the mountains, Ayana said eventually. It will remain for 2 more days, as my mother said. Silas glanced out the window again. You seem very certain. She is rarely wrong about such things. Ayana took another sip of her coffee. She says the spirits speak to her through the wind. And do you believe that? Ayana considered him with those dark, steady eyes. I believe my mother sees things others do not. Whether it is spirits or something else, she shrugged. It does not matter what I believe. Her visions come true. Like the vision that led you to me, Silas said, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Yes, Ayana set down her cup. You doubt because you do not understand. That is natural. What I don't understand, Silas said, is why an Apache woman would have visions about a man she's never met, or why you would spend 3 years searching for someone based on those visions. Ayana's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes, a hesitation perhaps, or a calculation. It is complicated, she said finally, and not entirely my story to tell. My mother will explain when she wakes. Before Silas could press further, a low moan came from the bed. Tallulah was stirring, one hand reaching vaguely outward, as if seeking something. Ayana immediately went to her side, taking the outstretched hand and speaking softly in Apache. The older woman's eyes opened, focusing first on her daughter, then shifting to find Silas by the fire. The storm has come, she said, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day. As I saw it would. Yes, Silas acknowledged. We're snowed in for now. Tallulah nodded as if this confirmed something important. Good. There is much to speak of, and now we have time. Ayana helped her mother sit up, propping her with the pillow, then brought her water and a small piece of bread that she must have prepared while Silas slept. Tallulah ate and drank slowly, gathering her strength. When she had finished, she gestured for Silas to come closer. Sit, she said, indicating the edge of the bed. I will tell you why we have sought you. Silas hesitated, then complied, settling at the foot of the bed while Ayana took her place on the floor beside her mother. There was something ceremonial about the arrangement, as if they were gathered for some ritual rather than a simple conversation. 5 years ago, Tallulah began, without preamble, on the night of the great fire that took your wife and unborn child, I was camped with my people near the place you call Devil's Backbone. I was younger then, stronger, but already known among my band as one who sees beyond the veil. She paused, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, as if looking back through time. That night I dreamed of a woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes like the summer sky. She stood in the midst of flames, yet they did not consume her. She spoke to me, though I did not then know her language, and showed me a vision of a man building a cabin alone in the wilderness, his heart as empty as the rooms he constructed. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Margaret's hair had indeed been auburn, like autumn leaves. He had often told her, and her eyes a clear, bright blue. He had never described her thus to anyone since her death. The woman told me her name was Margaret, Tallulah continued, and that her husband would need help to find his way back to the land of the living. She showed me his face, your face, Silas Sullivan, and the place where you would build your home. She showed me that one day you would find me near death in the snow, and that this meeting would be the beginning of a journey none of us yet understood. Tallulah's gaze shifted, focusing sharply on Silas. I did not seek this vision. I did not know you or your wife. But the dream came to me with the force of truth, and among my people such dreams are not ignored. Silas swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. That's impossible, he said, though with less conviction than he might have wished. Margaret died in that fire. She couldn't have communicated with you or anyone else. The division between the living and the dead is not as absolute as your people believe, Tallulah said. In the moment of passing, the spirit sees with perfect clarity. Your Margaret saw what lay ahead for you, years of isolation, of half living and she reached out across the divide to prevent it. Why? Silas demanded, anger rising to combat the unsettling resonance of Tallulah's words. Why would she reach out to you, a stranger, instead of to me? Because you had closed yourself to such messages, Tallulah replied simply. Your grief was too raw, too consuming. You would not have heard her. Silas stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. This is madness, he muttered. Complete madness. Yet you dreamed of her last night, Tallulah observed, and of my daughter whom you had never seen. How do you explain this? I don't know, Silas admitted. Maybe something in that tea you made, or maybe just coincidence. You do not believe in coincidence any more than I do, Tallulah said with surprising gentleness. You are a man who has survived by recognizing patterns, by reading signs. Your mind rebels against what your heart already knows to be true. Silas leaned against the wall, suddenly weary. Let's say for argument's sake that I believe you had this vision. That still doesn't explain why you've spent 3 years looking for me, or what you want from me now that you've found me. Tallulah exchanged a glance with Ayanna, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then she nodded as if giving permission. The vision of your wife was only the beginning, Ayanna said, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. 3 moons after the dream, my mother had another vision of a child born of 2 worlds who would not survive birth unless delivered under the roof of the man touched by fire and ash. She hesitated, one hand moving unconsciously to rest against her abdomen. I am with child Silas Sullivan, 4 months gone. Silas stared at her, noticing for the first time the slight thickening of her waist beneath the loose deerskin dress. And you think, what? That I'm supposed to help deliver your baby? The vision was clear, Tallulah interjected. The child would die if born anywhere but under your roof. And the child must live for its coming has been foretold by more than just my dreams. Silas ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. This is insane. I'm not a midwife. I don't know the first thing about delivering babies. And I certainly don't believe that my cabin has some magical property that will ensure a safe birth. It is not the cabin, Tallulah said. It is you. The man who lives between 2 worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead. You who survived when your family did not. You who build a life in the shadow of death. Stop it, Silas said sharply. Just stop. I don't want to hear any more about death or visions or spirits. He grabbed his coat from where it lay beside the hearth. I need some air. Neither woman tried to stop him as he yanked open the door, letting in a swirl of snow and bitter cold. He stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him, and stood on the porch breathing hard, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The snow had continued to fall steadily, now reaching halfway up his boot. The world beyond the clearing was obscured by a veil of white, the familiar landscape rendered strange and new. Silas leaned against the porch railing, letting the cold clear his head. What Tallulah had described was impossible. Dead women didn't send visions across whatever divide separated this world from the next. They didn't orchestrate elaborate meetings between strangers. They didn't reach out to save unborn children. And yet, how had Tallulah known about Margaret's hair and eyes? How had she known exactly where to find him in this remote corner of nowhere? How had Ayanna appeared in his dream before he had ever laid eyes on her? Damn it, Maggie, he whispered into the falling snow. What am I supposed to do with this? Only the soft hiss of snowflakes striking pine needles answered him. After several minutes, the cold began to seep through his coat, reminding him that standing in a snowstorm was no way to find clarity. With a sigh, Silas turned and re-entered the cabin. Inside, Tallulah had dozed off again, her energy seemingly depleted by the morning's conversation. Ayanna sat cross-legged before the fire, carefully cleaning and oiling Silas's rifle, a domestic task that struck him as oddly intimate. She glanced up as he entered, but said nothing, simply continuing her work with practiced hands. Silas hung his coat by the door and moved to warm himself by the fire. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the soft crackle of burning wood and the rhythmic sound of the cloth moving over metal. I'm sorry, he said finally, for walking out like that. Ayanna nodded once, acknowledging his apology without looking up. It is much to take in. That's an understatement. Silas watched her hands move over the rifle with practiced ease. You know your way around firearms. My father taught me, she replied. He believed a woman should be able to defend herself. Your father sounds like a wise man. A ghost of a smile touched Ayana's lips. He was a warrior who learned to live in peace, though it did not come easily to him. She set the rifle aside, finally meeting Silas's gaze. He died protecting a group of white settlers from raiders. Men from your army found him afterward and gave him a warrior's burial out of respect. That is why I wear his feather to honor his courage. The simple story offered without expectation or demand seemed to ease some of the tension that had built during Tallulah's revelations. Here was something tangible, human, a daughter's pride in her father, a shared understanding of loss. My father was a carpenter, Silas found himself saying, taught me everything I know about building. He died before the war influenza took him and my mother both in the same winter. Ayana nodded, accepting the exchange of personal history for what it was, a tentative bridge across the gulf of misunderstanding that had opened between them. The child's father, Silas said after a pause, gesturing vaguely toward her abdomen. Where is he? Ayana's expression hardened slightly. Gone. He was the son of a trader and a Cherokee woman, a man of two worlds, as my mother described him. He promised marriage but disappeared when he learned I was with child. She looked down at her hands. It is not an uncommon story. I'm sorry, Silas said and meant it. It is what it is. Ayana rose gracefully to her feet. I should prepare food. We will all need strength for the days ahead. She moved to the small pantry area where Silas kept his provisions, selecting ingredients with the confidence of someone at home in a kitchen. Silas watched her for a moment, then turned his attention to Tallulah, who slept peacefully, her chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. The strange tale she had told still jangled in his mind, like an out-of-tune piano hitting notes that were almost right, but fundamentally wrong. Yet there was a sincerity to both women that was difficult to dismiss. Whatever they believed it completely. And what of Margaret? The thought of her reaching out from beyond death was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Silas had never been a religious man, but the idea that something of his wife might have survived the fire, might have somehow found a way to send him a message. He shook his head. This line of thinking led nowhere good. The dead were dead. Margaret was gone along with their unborn child. No vision or prophecy would change that bitter truth. Yet as he watched Ayana work her movements graceful and purposeful, he couldn't help but wonder, what if? What if there was more to this world than he had allowed himself to believe? What if Margaret had somehow found a way to guide these women to his door? And if so, what was he supposed to do about it? The day passed slowly, the three of them confined to the small cabin as the storm continued unabated outside. Ayana prepared a simple but satisfying meal of cornbread and beans, seasoned with dried herbs from Tallulah's bundle. They ate mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. After the meal, Tallulah asked to see the piece of embroidery that Margaret had been working on. Silas hesitated, protective of this last tangible connection to his wife, but eventually withdrew it from his pocket and handed it to the older woman. Tallulah examined it carefully, her fingers tracing the half-finished letters. Our home, she read. She was making this for your cabin. For the house we were building in town, Silas corrected, before the fire. Tallulah nodded, her expression softening. She had a steady hand. The stitches are even, the pattern clean. She looked up at Silas. You carry this always? Yes. A heavy burden, she observed, returning the sampler to him, but a precious one. Silas carefully refolded the cloth and returned it to his pocket. It's all I have left of her. No, Tallulah said gently. You have your memories. You have the love she gave you. You have the life she would want you to live. She glanced at Ayana, who was cleaning up after the meal. And now, perhaps, you have a purpose she has guided you toward. Silas didn't respond, unwilling to either accept or reject the idea outright. Instead, he changed the subject. You said you've been looking for me for 3 years. Where have you been all this time? Everywhere and nowhere, Tallulah replied. We followed the vision west from the Devil's Backbone, through forests and across rivers, staying with different bands, when we could camping alone, when we could not. Always moving, always searching. She sighed. It has not been an easy journey. Why didn't you just ask in the settlement? Someone there could have directed you to my cabin. The vision was clear. I would find you in the snow near death. You would bring me to your home. That is how it had to be. Tallulah shrugged, as if the convoluted path were the most natural thing in the world. The spirits do not always choose the easiest way. So it seems, Silas muttered. The conversation lapsed into silence again. Outside, the wind had picked up driving snow against the windows with a sound like sand on glass. The early winter darkness was already falling, though it was barely mid-afternoon. Tallulah eventually dozed off again, her strength still not fully recovered. Ayanna took up her sewing, the same piece she had been working on the previous evening, which Silas now saw was a small garment, presumably for the child she carried. Restless and confined, Silas found himself pacing the small confines of the cabin. 5 years of solitude had made him unaccustomed to remaining indoors for long periods, especially in the company of others. The walls seemed to press in the air too close, too filled with unspoken thoughts and impossible claims. "You should rest," Ayanna said, glancing up from her sewing. "The storm makes everyone restless, but fighting it only brings exhaustion." "I'm fine," Silas replied, though he knew she was right. He had slept poorly the night before, his dreams haunted by Margaret's face and Tallulah's cryptic words. Ayanna set aside her sewing and rose, moving to the small shelf where Silas kept his few books, a Bible he rarely opened, a manual on trapping, a worn copy of Shakespeare's plays that Margaret had given him before the war, and a journal in which he occasionally recorded practical matters like weather patterns and game movements. She selected the Shakespeare, turning it over in her hands with obvious familiarity. "May I?" she asked, holding it up. Silas nodded, surprised. "You read Shakespeare?" "At the mission school," she confirmed, returning to her place by the fire. "The sisters believed that exposing us to civilized literature would hasten our salvation." A hint of irony touched her voice. "I found I enjoyed the stories, though not for the reasons they hoped." She opened the book, turning pages until she found what she was looking for. "The quality of mercy is not strained." She read, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that transformed the simple cabin. "It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes." Silas stared at her, momentarily dumbfounded. The incongruity of an Apache woman reciting Shakespeare in his remote cabin struck him as almost absurd, yet there was a quiet dignity in her delivery that commanded respect. "The Merchant of Venice," he said when she paused. "Margaret's favorite." Ayanna looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You know it." "She used to read to me," Silas admitted. "I never had much schooling, but she loved those plays, said they contained all of human nature, good and bad." He moved to sit in the chair opposite her. "I never expected to hear Shakespeare out here." "The words travel wherever they are carried," Ayanna said simply. She closed the book, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "Your wife had good taste." "Yes," Silas agreed softly. "She did." Another moment of connection, another small bridge across the divide of their different worlds. Silas found himself studying Ayanna with new interest. This woman who could recite Shakespeare and clean a rifle with equal proficiency, who carried herself with the quiet pride of her people, yet navigated the white man's world with apparent ease. "The mission school," he said. "How long were you there?" 4 years, she replied, "from the age of 12 to 16. My father believed knowledge of the white man's ways would help me survive in a changing world." A shadow crossed her face. He did not live to see whether he was right. "And your mother, was she supportive of this education?" Ayanna glanced at the sleeping Tallulah. "She was cautious, feared I would lose our ways, our beliefs. But she trusted my father's judgment." She smiled faintly. "And perhaps she saw something in her dreams that convinced her it was the right path." "Do you believe in her visions?" Silas asked, genuinely curious now. "Truly believe?" Ayanna considered the question carefully. "I believe my mother sees truths that others cannot," she said finally. "Whether they come from spirits or from some deep wisdom within her, I cannot say. But I have learned not to doubt them." She met his gaze directly. "She said we would find you, and we have. She said there would be a 3-day storm, and there is. These are not small things, Silas Sullivan." He couldn't argue with that logic, tenuous though it might be. "And the child?" he asked, nodding toward her abdomen. "Do you believe it will time if born anywhere but here?" A flicker of fear crossed Ayanna's face, the first genuine vulnerability he had seen in her. "I do not know," she whispered, "but I cannot take the risk. This child is all I have now." The simple honesty of her answer touched something in Silas that had long been dormant. Here was no elaborate spiritual claim, no mysterious prophecy, just a mother's fear for her unborn child, a fear he understood all too well. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to frighten you." It is a fear I have carried since the vision came to my mother, Ayana acknowledged, but fear serves no purpose except to prepare us for what must be faced. She straightened her shoulders. Whatever comes, I will meet it. The quiet strength in her voice reminded Silas suddenly painfully of Margaret in those last months before the fire, determined to face the birth of their child with courage, despite her own fears. The comparison brought an unexpected lump to his throat. You should try to sleep, Ayana said, misinterpreting his silence. I will watch over my mother. Silas nodded, grateful for the suggestion that allowed him to retreat from the conversation and the uncomfortable emotions it had stirred. He returned to his makeshift bed by the hearth, stretching out on the hard floor and pulling the blanket over himself. Despite his restlessness, earlier exhaustion claimed him quickly. As he drifted towards sleep, the last thing he saw was Ayana's silhouette against the fire, her head bent over her, sewing the eagle feather in her hair, catching the golden light. In his dreams, he stood again in the burning house flames, licking at the walls, but somehow not touching him. Margaret was there as she always was in this recurring nightmare, but this time she was not consumed by fire. Instead, she stood calmly in the center of the inferno, her hands cradling her swollen belly. It wasn't your fault, she said as she had in the previous night's dream. It never was. I should have been there, Silas replied, the words torn from him by old grief. I could have saved you. Margaret shook her head, her auburn hair gleaming in the firelight. No, my love, nothing could have saved us. It was our time. She stepped closer, though the flames still separated them. But it is not your time, not yet. You have much still to do. What? He asked desperately. What am I supposed to do? Instead of answering, Margaret gestured to her right. There stood Ayana, also untouched by the flames, her hand resting protectively over her own belly. Beside her was a small child, a girl of perhaps 3 or 4, with Ayana's dark hair and eyes but lighter skin, a reflection of her mixed heritage. They need you, Margaret said, and you need them. I don't understand, Silas protested. Why them? Why now? Because you have been alone too long. Margaret replied, her voice fading as the dream began to dissolve. Because some lives are meant to intertwine even across the divide of worlds. Silas woke with a case of his heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the low glow of the banked fire. Outside, the wind had died down, though he could still hear the soft patter of falling snow against the roof. He lay still, trying to recapture the details of the dream before they slipped away. Margaret had seemed so real, so present, not a phantom or a memory, but his wife as she had been, full of life and quiet wisdom. And the child beside Ayana, a daughter with her mother's features but lighter skin. Silas sat up, running a hand through his hair. 2 consecutive nights of such vivid, connected dreams could not be dismissed as mere coincidence, no matter how much his rational mind wanted to do so. Something was happening, something beyond his understanding or control. A soft sound drew his attention to the bed where Tallulah sat awake, watching him in the dim light. She seemed to have been expecting his sudden wakefulness. You saw her again, she said softly, not a question but a statement. Silas nodded, not bothering to deny it. And a child, a girl, with Ayana. Tallulah's expression didn't change, but something like satisfaction flickered in her eyes. Yes, the child of 2 worlds. You knew, Silas accused, keeping his voice low, to avoid waking Ayana, who slept soundly beside her mother. You knew I would dream of her. I hoped, Tallulah corrected. The spirits do not always speak to those who have closed themselves off as you have. But your Margaret is persistent. A small smile touched her lips. She was like that in life too, I think. Silas couldn't help but return the smile, though it was tinged with sadness. Yes, she was. Stubborn as the day is long when she set her mind to something. A good quality in a woman, Tallulah observed. My daughter has it too. Silas glanced at the sleeping Ayana, noting the stubborn set of her jaw even in repose. I've noticed. She has not had an easy life, Tallulah said, following his gaze. Caught between worlds belonging fully to neither. Too educated for our people, too Apache for yours. She sighed. I feared for her future even before the child. Now you believe I'm somehow meant to help her, Ahmad finished for her. Not just help, Tallulah corrected. Save, both her and the child. She fixed him with that penetrating stare that seemed to see through all pretense. You know what it is to lose a child before it draws breath, Silas Sullivan. Would you wish that pain on another? The question struck him like a physical blow. Of course not, he said sharply, but I don't see how my cabin or my presence can prevent such a tragedy. The ways of the spirits are not always clear to us, Tallulah admitted. But the vision was specific. The child will die if born anywhere but under your roof. And the child must live, for she has a purpose of her own to fulfill. She, Silas caught the pronoun. You know it's a girl. Tallulah nodded. A daughter, as you saw in your dream, a bridge between peoples, between worlds. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. There is more I have not told you, more that my daughter does not yet know. The child's father was not just any man of mixed blood. He was Nathan Hargrove. The name hit Silas like a bucket of ice water. Hargrove, he repeated. As in? William Hargrove's son, yes, Tallulah confirmed. The son of the man who ordered the fire that killed your wife and unborn child. Silas stood abruptly, moving away from Tallulah, as if physical distance could somehow mitigate the impact of her words. That's impossible, he said, though his mind was already racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. How could you possibly know about Hargrove, about what he did? Your Margaret showed me, Tallulah replied simply. In the vision, she stood in the flames and pointed to a man in a fine hut giving orders to others. She spoke his name, William Hargrove, and showed how he had arranged for the fire to appear as an accident. Silas leaned against the wall, his legs suddenly weak. For 5 years he had believed the fire that claimed Margaret and their child had been just that, a tragic accident, a lamp knocked over, perhaps, or a spark from the fireplace. The alternative had been too painful to contemplate, but deep down he had always wondered. The fire had started so quickly, spread so completely, and it had come just days after he had discovered irregularities in the railroad company's land acquisitions, evidence that Hargrove had been bribing officials and intimidating native landholders to secure rights of way for his expanding empire. Silas had confronted Hargrove privately, threatening to take the evidence to the territorial governor. Hargrove had laughed, dismissing him as a naive idealist who didn't understand the realities of progress. Go home to your pretty wife Sullivan, he had said. Forget what you think you know if you want her to stay pretty. 3 days later, the fire had claimed everything Silas loved. He had never connected the two events, too consumed by grief to see the pattern. But now, why didn't you tell me this yesterday? He demanded, anger rising through his shock. Why wait until now? You were not ready to hear it, Tallulah said. You would have dismissed it as madness as you did the rest of my vision. She gestured to the window where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to penetrate the storm clouds. But now you have dreamed. Now you have begun to see. Now you can understand what is at stake. Silas shook his head, trying to clear it of the rage and confusion swirling like the snow outside. I don't understand anything, he said bitterly, except that you've been keeping the truth from me. Not keeping it from you, Tallulah corrected, waiting for the right moment to share it. She glanced at Ayanna, ensuring she still slept. My daughter does not know who the father of her child truly is. She knows only that he was the son of a trader and a Cherokee woman, which is true as far as it goes. She does not know of his connection to you or of his father's crimes. Why keep it from her? To protect her heart, Tallulah said simply. She believed Nathan loved her. Learning that he sought her out deliberately as part of his father's schemes would break something in her that I fear could not be mended. Silas frowned. What schemes? What are you talking about? Tallulah sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. William Hargrove has been buying or stealing native lands for his railroad for many years. But some lands, sacred lands, including those where my people have buried our dead for generations, have special protections under treaties with your government. They cannot be sold or transferred except to direct descendants of the tribes that hold them. Understanding dawned. So Hargrove sent his half-Cherokee son to produce a child who would have a claim to those lands. Silas said, disgust coloring his voice. A child who could legally sign away the rights when she came of age. Yes, Tallulah confirmed, though he did not count on my daughter's strength or her decision to keep the child rather than surrender it, as Nathan demanded when he learned she was pregnant. A fierce pride gleamed in her eyes. She told him she would raise the child in our ways, not his. He left that night and never returned. And now you think Hargrove is still looking for her, for the child? I know he is, Tallulah said gravely. My visions have shown him sending men to find us, to bring Ayana back by force if necessary. It is why we have been moving constantly, staying with different bands, never remaining in one place long enough to be discovered. She leaned forward intently. And it is why the spirits have guided us here to you, the one man who has as much reason to stand against William Hargrove as we do. Silas turned away, moving to the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, though, with less fury than the previous day. The world was buried in a white pristine and peaceful, belying the turmoil in his heart. 5 years he had lived with the belief that Margaret's death was a tragic accident. 5 years of grief without the bitter companion of rage. Now, in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. William Hargrove, the man he had once respected, had worked for, had trusted, had deliberately ordered the death of his wife and unborn child. And somehow, through some mechanism, he couldn't begin to comprehend, Margaret had reached across the divide between life and death to set these events in motion, bringing Tallulah and Ayana to his door, revealing Hargrove's crime, connecting him to the unborn child who carried the blood of both his greatest enemy and the people Hargrove had systematically oppressed. It was too much to process, too tangled a web to unravel in the quiet dawn of a snowbound morning. "Why tell me now?" he asked finally, his back still to Tallulah. "What do you expect me to do with this information?" "For now, nothing," Tallulah replied, "except to understand why we have come to you and why your help is so vital. When the time is right for action, you will know." "And Ayana, when will you tell her the truth about Nathan, about his connection to me?" "When she is ready to hear it," Tallulah said. "After the child is born, perhaps. For now, the knowledge would only add to her burden." She paused. "Unless you feel compelled to tell her yourself." Silas turned back to face her. "It's not my place to share such things." "No," Tallulah agreed, "it is not. But it is your place to protect her and the child now that you know what is at stake." Before Silas could respond, Ayana stirred, her eyes opening to the new day. She took in the scene Silas by the window. Her mother sitting up in bed, and immediately sensed the tension in the air. "What has happened?" she asked, rising gracefully to her feet. "Nothing," Tallulah assured her. "Silas and I were just discussing the storm. It begins to ease, I think." Ayana looked skeptical but didn't press the issue. Instead, she moved to check her mother's temperature with a gentle touch to the forehead. "The fever is gone," she observed with satisfaction. "You grow stronger." "Yes," Tallulah agreed. "Thanks to your care and Silas's hospitality." Ayana turned to Silas. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all you have done for us." The gratitude in her voice, earnest and unembellished, struck Silas as almost unbearable in light of what he now knew. This woman, this proud, capable woman, had been manipulated and abandoned by Nathan Hargrove as part of a scheme to steal her people's land. And now she carried a child who would be hunted from birth, a pawn in a game of greed and power she didn't even know was being played. "You don't need to thank me," he said more gruffly than he had intended. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Ayana replied with quiet certainty. "They would not." She moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the banked embers with practiced efficiency. "I will make breakfast. We all need strength for the day ahead." As she busied herself with the familiar routine, Silas caught Tallulah watching him, her expression unreadable. A silent understanding passed between them. The truth would remain unspoken for now, a shared burden they would carry, while Ayana focused on the more immediate concerns of survival and her unborn child. Silas turned back to the window, watching the falling snow with new eyes. For 5 years he had lived in a kind of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor truly dead, existing in the shadow of what he had lost. Now, through some chain of events he could scarcely comprehend, he found himself drawn back into the world of the living, of consequences and responsibilities, of anger and protection, of justice long deferred. William Hargrove had taken everything from him, and now, through some cosmic irony or divine intervention, Hargrove's grandchild might be the instrument of his reckoning. The thought should have brought satisfaction, or at least a grim sense of poetic justice. Instead, Silas felt only a growing resolve to protect Ayana and her unborn daughter, not for vengeance, but because it was right, because Margaret would have wanted it, because 5 years of empty existence had left a void that purpose, however unexpected, might begin to fill. Behind him, the cabin stirred with the quiet sounds of morning, the crackle of the fire, the soft clatter of cooking utensils, the low murmur of conversation between mother and daughter. Ordinary sounds, domestic sounds so long absent from his solitary life that they seemed almost foreign to his ears. Yet underneath these mundane noises lay the whisper of something larger taking shape, a convergence of past and future, of grievance and redemption, of lives interconnected across the boundaries of race and time, and even death itself. Silas took a deep breath, feeling something shift within him, the first tentative stirrings of a man long dormant beginning to awaken to possibility once more. The storm continued through the day, though with diminishing force. By evening, the snow had lightened to occasional flurries, and patches of clear sky could be seen between the clouds. The worst had passed, just as Tallulah had predicted. Inside the cabin, a fragile routine had established itself. Tallulah, still weak but improving, spent much of the day seated by the fire working on a small medicine pouch adorned with intricate beadwork. Aiyana took charge of cooking and other domestic tasks with quiet efficiency, moving through the small space as if she had lived there for years rather than days. Silas found himself alternately restless and contemplative, his mind returning again and again to Tallulah's revelations. The knowledge that William Hargrove had deliberately ordered the fire that killed Margaret burned in him like a coal smoldering beneath the surface of his thoughts. Yet he found himself oddly reluctant to act on this knowledge, at least for now. There would be time for reckoning once the storm had passed, once Aisiana and her mother were safe. In the meantime, he busied himself with small repairs around the cabin, fixing a loose shutter, reinforcing the door hinges, tasks that had been neglected in his years of bare minimum existence. The physical work helped to channel his restless energy and gave him a sense of purpose, however modest. As evening fell, Aiyana prepared a more elaborate meal than usual, rabbit stew enriched with dried berries from her mother's bundle and cornbread baked in the small Dutch oven Silas rarely used. The resulting feast, simple though it was, filled the cabin with aromas that reminded Silas of another life, another home long ago. They ate together at the small table, an arrangement that felt oddly formal after the casual meals of the previous days. Tallulah seemed stronger sitting upright without assistance and eating with genuine appetite. Aiyana was quieter than usual, her gaze often drifting to the window, where the clearing sky revealed the first stars of evening. "The storm passes," she observed during a lull in the conversation. "Tomorrow the sun will return." "Yes," Tallulah agreed, "and with it, decisions to be made." Silas looked up from his bowl. "What decisions?" "Whether we stay or go," Tallulah said simply. "Whether you will have us until the child comes, or whether we must continue our search elsewhere." The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Silas was acutely aware of Aiyana's eyes on him, her expression carefully neutral, yet somehow vulnerable beneath the composure. "I told you when we met that I prefer to be alone," he said slowly. "That's been true for 5 years, but—" Oh, he paused, weighing his words carefully. "But perhaps it's time for that to change." Aiyana's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of her surprise. "You would allow us to stay?" "Yes," Silas said, the decision feeling both momentous and somehow inevitable. "Until the child is born, at least. After that?" He shrugged. "We'll see." Tallulah nodded as if his answer was exactly what she had expected. "Thank you, Silas Sullivan. Your kindness will not be forgotten." "It's not kindness," Silas corrected, unwilling to accept gratitude for what felt more like surrender to forces beyond his control than any act of generosity. "It's—" He hesitated, unsure how to explain his motives without revealing what he knew about Nathan Hargrove and his connection to William. "It's the right thing to do," he finished lamely. "Sometimes doing the right thing is the greatest kindness of all," Tallulah observed with a small smile, "especially when it costs us something." Silas didn't respond to this, instead turning the conversation to practical matters. "The cabin's small for 3 people and will be tighter still with a child. I'll need to expand it, add another room at least. And there are supplies to consider, preparations for the birth." "We will help," Aiyana said firmly. "I am strong and my mother's knowledge of herbs and healing will be valuable. We will not be burdens." "I didn't say you would be," Silas replied, softening his tone at the flash of pride in her eyes. "Just thinking aloud about what needs to be done." "There is time," Tallulah interjected. "The child will not come until the first moon of spring. Many weeks yet to prepare." Silas nodded mentally, calculating the work ahead. The addition would need to be built before the worst of winter set in, a challenging prospect, but not impossible with help. Supplies could be obtained from the settlement, though that would mean explaining the presence of two Apache women to the sometimes hostile settlers. And then there was the matter of William Hargrove and his men potentially searching for Ayanna and her unborn child. One step at a time, he reminded himself. Today's decision was enough for now. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. After the meal, as Ayanna cleaned the dishes and Tallulah returned to her beadwork by the fire, Silas stepped outside to check the weather. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant against the black velvet of the sky. The snow had stopped completely, and a half-moon cast blue-white light across the transformed landscape. He stood on the porch, breathing deeply of the crisp air, trying to process the events of the past 3 days and the decision he had just made. 5 years of solitude ended by the arrival of two women who claimed to have been guided to him by his dead wife's spirit. 5 years of grief without direction, suddenly given purpose by the unborn child of his enemy's son. 5 years of merely existing now, potentially transformed into truly living once more. It was madness by any rational measure. Yet standing there in the moonlight, looking at the pristine snow that covered all that had come before, Silas felt something he had not experienced in years. A sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Behind him, the cabin door opened softly. Ayanna stepped out, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. "Beautiful night," she said, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "Yes," Silas agreed. "Storm's blown itself out completely." They stood in companionable silence for a time, their breath clouding in the cold air. The only sound the occasional soft plop of snow falling from the trees as branches shifted in the gentle breeze. "Thank you," Ayanna said finally, "for allowing us to stay. I know it was not an easy decision." Silas glanced at her, noting the way the moonlight silvered her features, emphasizing the proud line of her jaw and the quiet strength in her eyes. "Easier than you might think," he admitted. "This place has been empty for too long." Ayanna nodded, understanding the admission for what it was, not just a comment on the cabin's sparse furnishings, but on the hollow existence he had carved out for himself in the aftermath of loss. "My father used to say that a home without voices is just a shelter," she offered, "that it takes more than walls and a roof to truly live." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Ayanna pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "He would have liked you, I think. You have the same stillness in you, the same patience." The compliment, unexpected and sincere, caught Silas off guard. "I'm not sure patience is the right word for what I've been doing these past 5 years," he said ruefully. "More like waiting without knowing what I was waiting for." Ayanna considered this. "Perhaps you were waiting for us," she suggested, the hint of a smile softening her usually serious expression, "though I doubt that thought would have brought you much comfort." Despite himself, Silas chuckled, a rusty sound unfamiliar to his own ears. "No, I can't say it would have." He shook his head, still marveling at the strange turn his life had taken. "If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be sharing my cabin with two Apache women, one of them expecting a child, I'd have thought they were touched in the head. And now, Silas looked out at the moonlit clearing, the snow-laden pines, the star-filled sky above. Now I'm starting to think that maybe I've been the one who was touched it all along. Living out here alone, cutting myself off from everything and everyone. Grief does that," Ayanna said softly. "It narrows the world until there is only the pain and the empty space where what was lost used to be." She placed a hand unconsciously on her abdomen. "I felt that way when my father died. Like the world had shrunk to the size of my sorrow." "What changed it?" Silas asked, genuinely curious. "Time. My mother's wisdom, the needs of our people." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then added, "And now this child, a new life to focus on, a future to protect." She looked at him directly. "Sometimes we need a purpose outside ourselves to find our way back to living." The simple truth of her words resonated deeply with Silas. A purpose outside himself, wasn't that what he had been lacking all these years? Not just the absence of Margaret and their unborn child, but the absence of any reason to do more than simply survive from one day to the next. "Your mother believes your child has a special destiny," he said carefully, not wanting to reveal more than Tallulah had deemed appropriate. "That she'll be important somehow." Ayana's expression grew serious again. My mother sees many things in her dreams, some clear, some shrouded in mystery. But yes, she believes this child will matter not just to us, but to others. She sighed her breath, a white plume in the cold air. It is a heavy burden to place on one not yet born. All parents place burdens on their children, Silas observed. Hopes, expectations, dreams of what they might become. It's part of loving them, I suppose. Perhaps, Iana conceded. But most children are not sought by powerful men before they draw their first breath. The statement delivered with such matter-of-fact resignation reminded Silas sharply of what Tallulah had revealed that morning, that William Hargrove was actively searching for Ayanna and her unborn child, seeing the infant as nothing more than a means to acquire land he coveted. You know about Hargrove? He said, the name slipping out before he could consider the implications. About William Hargrove. Ayanna's head snapped up, her eyes widening in surprise. How do you know that name? Silas cursed inwardly, realizing his mistake too late. Your mother mentioned him, he said, which was technically true if incomplete. She said he was looking for you. Ayanna studied him intently, clearly, sensing there was more to the story than he was revealing. Yes, she said slowly. William Hargrove, a powerful man who builds railroads across our lands. Nathan's father, though few know of the connection. Her expression hardened. A man who believes everything and everyone has a price. You've met him? Silas asked, surprised. Once, Ayanna confirmed. He came to the trading post where Nathan worked months before I realized I was carrying his child. He looked at me as if I were a piece of property to be acquired. She shuddered slightly at the memory. I did not understand then why he took such interest in his son's association with an Apache woman. Now I do. Now, after Nathan abandoned me, one of the elders of our band explained what Hargrove has been doing, using his half-Cherokee son to create a child who would have claim to protected lands. Ayanna's voice was steady, but Silas could see the hurt and anger beneath her composure. A child who could be controlled, manipulated into signing away rights that no full-blooded native could legally transfer. So she did know, at least partially. Silas felt an odd mix of relief and concern at this revelation. That's why you've been moving constantly, he said, to stay ahead of Hargrove's men. Ayanna nodded. We received warning from friends among the Cherokee that he had sent hunters to find us, men who would not hesitate to take me by force if necessary. Her hand moved protectively over her belly. I will die before I let him use my child that way. The fierce determination in her voice left no doubt that she meant every word. Silas felt a surge of admiration for her courage, followed quickly by a renewed sense of responsibility. This woman and her unborn daughter needed protection, not just from the natural dangers of childbirth, but from the very real threat posed by William Hargrove and his ambitions. He won't get near you or the child, Silas said, the words emerging as a solemn vow. Not while I have breath in my body. Ayanna looked at him with genuine surprise. Why would you make such a promise? You owe us nothing. For a moment, Silas considered telling her everything about Margaret, about the fire, about William Hargrove's role in destroying his family. But something held him back. Perhaps it was respect for Tallulah's wishes, perhaps fear of adding to Ayanna's burdens, or perhaps simply the recognition that some truths were better revealed in their own time. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see William Hargrove thwarted, he said instead, and leave it at that for now. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story. But she didn't press, merely nodding her acceptance of his partial explanation. Then we are fortunate indeed, she said, to have found a man whose interests align so well with our own. A small smile touched her lips. Perhaps my mother's visions are more practical than I sometimes give her credit for. Silas returned the smile, oddly warmed by the simple exchange. Perhaps they are. They stood together a while longer, watching the moon's slow passage across the star-filled sky, each lost in private thoughts, yet somehow connected by the shared understanding of what lay ahead. Challenges and dangers, yes, but faced together rather than alone. When Ayanna finally shivered despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Silas opened the cabin door for her with a courtesy that would have seemed foreign to him just days before. We should get inside, he said. Tomorrow will be a busy day. Yes, Ayanna agreed, pausing at the threshold. The first of many, I think. As she passed him to enter the cabin, Silas caught the faint scent of pine and something herbal sage perhaps that seemed to cling to her hair and skin. It was a clean, earthy smell reminiscent of the forest after rain. He found himself oddly comforted by it, as if it represented something authentic and unpretentious in a world too often defined by deception and betrayal. Inside, Tallulah looked up from her beadwork, her knowing eyes taking in their return with quiet assessment. If she noted the subtle shift in their relationship, a new ease, a tentative trust beginning to form, she gave no sign beyond a small nod of apparent satisfaction. "The night is clear," she observed. "Tomorrow the sun returns." "Yes," Silas agreed, hanging his coat by the door. And with it, work to be done. As he prepared for sleep that night, arranging his bedroll near the fire, while Ayanna settled beside her mother on the bed, Silas found himself looking forward to the morning with an anticipation he had not felt in years. There would be challenges ahead, certainly the cabin to expand supplies to gather preparations for the birth, and always the looming threat of William Hargrove and his men. Yet for the first time since the fire that had claimed Margaret and their unborn child, he felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. These women, brought to him by circumstances he still couldn't fully comprehend, had awakened something he had thought long dead, a desire to protect, to build, to look toward a future rather than remain mired in the past. As he drifted toward sleep, warmed by the fire and the quiet breathing of his unexpected companions, Silas found himself thinking of Margaret's words in his dream. "They need you, and you need them." Perhaps after all this time she had been right. Spring came slowly to the Texas frontier, reluctantly surrendering winter's grip in fits and starts. February gave way to March with alternating days of brilliant sunshine and bitter cold, the ground thawing only to freeze again, the first tentative wildflowers emerging only to be covered by unexpected snow. But by early April the transformation was undeniable. The forest awakening with new growth, birds returning to nest in the pines, and the creek behind Silas's cabin running high and fast with snowmelt from the higher elevations. The cabin itself had undergone its own transformation. What had once been a single room now extended into a second chamber, built by Silas through the coldest weeks of winter, with occasional help from John Weathers, a taciturn trapper who asked few questions about the two Apache women now living at the Sullivan place. The new room was small but solidly constructed, with a window that caught the morning light and walls lined with shelves for Tallulah's growing collection of herbs and medicines. Inside, the once sparse interior now showed signs of permanent habitation. Colorful woven blankets draped over chairs, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, beams, pottery vessels containing various staples and supplies. A cradle stood near the hearth, crafted by Silas from pine and cedar, its surface sanded smooth and adorned with symbols that Tallulah had instructed him to carve protection signs, she said, to ward off evil spirits. But the most profound change was in Silas himself. The past 3 months had erased years from his face, softening the hard lines of solitude and grief into something more alive, more present. He still carried the weight of his loss, still kept Margaret's half-finished sampler in his pocket, but the burden no longer defined him completely. There was purpose in his movements, direction in his gaze, the tentative rebirth of a man long dormant. On this particular morning in mid-April, Silas stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. The air was cool but held the promise of warmth, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. From inside came the soft sounds of movement, Ayanna preparing breakfast, Tallulah sorting through her medicines. Ordinary sounds that had become, over the winter months, a comforting backdrop to his days. "It will be today," Tallulah said, appearing silently beside him. Despite her age, she moved with surprising stealth when she chose to a skill Silas had never quite grown accustomed to. "The men from town." Silas glanced at her, noting the certainty in her weathered face. 3 months of living with Tallulah's predictions had taught him not to dismiss them, no matter how implausible they might seem. "Hargrove's men?" he asked, keeping his voice low to prevent Ayanna from overhearing. "No," Tallulah replied. "Not directly. Men from the settlement, but asking questions for him, looking for an Apache woman with child." She nodded toward the trail that led toward town. "They will come before midday." Silas's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this in a way ever since his trip to the settlement last month for supplies. There had been too many curious glances, too many abruptly silenced conversations when he entered the general store. Word had spread about the Apache women living at the Sullivan place and in a territory where relations between settlers and native peoples remained tense at best. Such arrangements inevitably attracted attention. "What do you see?" he asked Tallulah, having learned that her visions often contained details that could prove useful. "Three men," she said, her eyes slightly unfocused, as if seeing something beyond the physical landscape before them. "One young eager for trouble, one older reluctant but following, and one who leads them, a man with papers and fine boots who does not belong in this territory." "A representative from Hargrove," Silas concluded grimly, "come to confirm the rumors." "Yes." Tallulah's focus returned to the present. "They must not see Aiyana. Her time is too close now." Silas nodded in agreement. Aiyana's pregnancy had progressed steadily through the winter, her belly now full and round beneath the looser dresses she had fashioned from fabric purchased in town. According to Tallulah's calculations, the child would arrive with the next full moon less than 2 weeks away. "I'll send her to the cave," he said, referring to a small cavern they had discovered behind the waterfall at the creek where they had established an emergency shelter with supplies and bedding. "You should go with her." Tallulah shook her head. "No, I must be here." Tallulah, the men will be suspicious if no one is here but you," she interrupted firmly. "They know you live with two Apache women. Finding you alone would only confirm their doubts." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but insistent. "I will stay. I am just an old woman of no interest to them. Aiyana will be safe in the cave until they are gone." Silas wanted to argue further but recognized the wisdom in her plan. "All right," he conceded, "but at the first sign of trouble, you head for the creek too. I can handle whatever comes." Tallulah's eyes softened. "I know you can, Silas Sullivan. You have grown strong again these past months." A small smile touched her lips. Margaret would be proud. The mention of his wife's name no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. In the months since Tallulah and Aiyana had entered his life, Silas had come to an uneasy peace with Margaret's memory, not forgetting her, never that, but finding a way to carry her with him without being crushed by the weight. "I hope so," he said quietly. Inside the cabin, Aiyana moved about the main room, her swollen belly making her usual graceful movements slightly awkward. She wore a dress of deep blue cotton, purchased in town and modified to accommodate her pregnancy, her dark hair braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. At nearly 9 months, she remained strikingly beautiful, though there was a new vulnerability to her that Silas found himself responding to with unexpected protectiveness. "Aiyana," he said, entering with Tallulah behind him. "We need to talk." She looked up from the cornbread she was slicing, immediately alert to the tension in his voice. "What is it?" "Men from town are coming," Silas explained, keeping his tone even. Tallulah saw them in a vision. "They're asking questions about you." Aiyana's hand went instinctively to her belly. "Hargrove," she said, not a question, but a statement. "Not directly, but yes, I think they are gathering information for him." Silas moved closer, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. "I need you to go to the cave until they're gone, just as a precaution." Over the winter, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Not quite romance, but something deeper than friendship. A partnership born of shared purpose and growing trust, expressed more in actions than in words. Silas had never presumed upon her vulnerability, never crossed the boundaries of propriety. But there was a comfort between them now, a natural physical ease that allowed for simple touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing, while passing a tool, a supportive arm when the path was treacherous. Aiyana searched his face, finding no room for argument in his expression. "When will they arrive?" "Before midday," Tallulah answered for him. "You should go now with enough time to be settled before they come." "I've packed a bag already," Silas said. "Food, water, blankets, everything you'll need for a day or two just in case." Aiyana's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been expecting this." "We all have," he replied honestly. "It was only a matter of time before Hargrove's reach extended this far." He squeezed her shoulders gently. "It's just a precaution, Aiyana. Better safe than sorry." She nodded reluctantly. "What about Mother?" "I'm staying," Tallulah said firmly. "They expect to find two Apache women. Finding Silas alone would only raise more questions." Aiyana looked like she wanted to protest but thought better of it. "Very well," she said, removing her apron. "I'll go now." While she gathered a few personal items, Silas checked the rifle that hung above the door, ensuring it was loaded and ready. He had no desire for violence, but neither would he stand by if these men posed a threat to Ayanna or her unborn child. They will not need to be met with force, Tallulah said softly, observing his preparations. Not today. Today they come only to look to confirm what they have heard. The true danger lies ahead. When Apache, Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. When the child is born, Tallulah confirmed, Hargrove will send men, then men with orders to take both Ayanna and the infant. Silas's jaw tightened. They'll have to go through me first. Yes, Tallulah agreed, a shadow crossing her face. That is what I fear. Before Silas could question her further, Ayanna emerged from the second room, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the mild spring day. She moved with the careful deliberation of a woman in late pregnancy, one hand supporting her lower back. I'm ready, she said. Silas picked up the pack he had prepared and slung it over his shoulder. I'll walk you to the cave. The path to the creek was well worn now, months of daily use having beaten down the underbrush and packed the earth into a clear trail. They walked in silence, Silas shortening his stride to match Ayanna's slower pace, occasionally offering his arm for support when the ground grew uneven. The waterfall came into view, a slender ribbon of water cascading over a rocky ledge into a deep pool below. Behind the falling water, accessible by a narrow path along the cliff face, was the cave, small but dry, its entrance mostly hidden by the curtain of water. Silas helped Ayanna navigate the slippery rocks, steadying her with a firm hand as they edged along the cliff to the cave entrance. Inside, the space was cool and dim, but not uncomfortable. He had stocked it weeks ago with essentials, a pallet made from pine boughs covered with blankets, a small store of firewood, though they would use it only in dire emergency to avoid the telltale smoke, a lantern, and various supplies secured in waterproof containers. It's not much, he said apologetically as he set down the pack, but it should be safe enough for a day. Ayanna surveyed the small space, then turned to him with a faint smile. You've thought of everything as usual. She lowered herself carefully onto the pallet, adjusting her position to accommodate her belly. I'll be fine, Silas. Go back and help Mother prepare for our visitors. He hesitated, reluctant to leave her alone in her condition. If anything happens, anything at all, use this, he said, handing her a small metal whistle. 3 short blasts. I'll hear it from the cabin. Ayanna accepted the whistle, tucking it into the pocket of her dress. Nothing will happen, she assured him. This child is not ready to greet the world just yet. She patted her belly. We've had many conversations on the matter, and she has agreed to wait for the full moon, as her grandmother predicted. Silas couldn't help but smile at that. Over the winter, he had come to appreciate Ayanna's quiet humor, the way she balanced pragmatism with the more mystical beliefs of her people. It was one of many qualities he had discovered in her during their months of close proximity: her patience, her resilience, her fierce intelligence, her gentle strength. Nevertheless, he said, the whistle, promise me. I promise, she said solemnly, though her eyes held a hint of amusement at his protectiveness. With a final nod, Silas ducked out of the cave and retraced his steps along the cliff face. At the edge of the creek, he paused, looking back at the waterfall that now concealed Ayanna from view. A strange tightness gripped his chest, not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness of what was at stake. After months of preparation, the confrontation they had been anticipating was finally beginning to take shape. William Hargrove, the man responsible for Margaret's death, was reaching out across the miles to threaten another woman under Silas's protection. This time, Silas vowed silently the outcome would be different. He returned to the cabin to find Tallulah sitting calmly on the porch, her hands busy with beadwork, presenting the very picture of an elderly woman enjoying the spring sunshine. Only the tension around her eyes betrayed her awareness of the approaching danger. She is settled, Tallulah asked as he mounted the steps. Yes, Silas confirmed. Safe and comfortable, at least for now. Tallulah nodded, returning to her beadwork. They come, she said without looking up. I hear their horses. Silas strained his ears, but caught no sound. Still, he had learned to trust Tallulah's senses, which often seemed to extend beyond the merely physical. He moved to the door, retrieving his rifle from above it, then returned to sit in the second chair on the porch, the weapon across his knees, not threatening but visible. They waited in silence, Tallulah's fingers moving steadily through her beadwork, Silas outwardly calm, though his muscles were tense for action. After several minutes, he too heard the distant sound of horses, 3 sets of hooves approaching, at a leisurely pace up the trail from town. "Remember," Tallulah said quietly, "they come only to look today, to confirm what they have heard." "And what have they heard exactly?" Silas asked, his eyes fixed on the bend in the trail where the riders would first become visible. That Silas Sullivan, who has lived alone since the death of his wife, now shares his home with two Apache women, one of them young and with child. Tallulah's hands stilled on her beadwork. "They wish to know if the child's father is white, and if so, who he might be." Silas's jaw tightened. The implication was clear in the territory's relations between white men and native women were common enough, though rarely acknowledged in polite society. But a white man publicly living with and potentially fathering a child with an Apache woman, that would raise eyebrows, and in the current climate of tension between settlers and native peoples, potentially much worse. "Let me do the talking," he said as the sound of hooves grew louder. "These men don't need to know our business." Tallulah inclined her head in agreement, returning to her beadwork with apparent indifference to the approaching visitors. The riders appeared around the bend in the trail, three men just as Tallulah had foreseen. Leading them was a stranger to Silas, a man of perhaps 40, with a city dweller's complexion, and the fine boots Tallulah had mentioned looking decidedly out of place on the frontier. Behind him rode Tom Jenkins, a local rancher known for his volatile temper and vocal distrust of Indians. And bringing up the rear was Elijah Carter, the elderly owner of the general store in town, his expression suggesting he would rather be anywhere else. The men reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene before them. Silas with rifle in hand, Tallulah serenely working at her beads, the expanded cabin with its new room clearly built to accommodate additional occupants. "Sullivan," Jenkins called in greeting, though his tone held no warmth. "Been a while since you've shown your face in town." "Jenkins," Silas acknowledged with a nod. "Carter." He fixed his gaze on the stranger. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure." The well-dressed man dismounted with the awkward movements of someone unaccustomed to horseback, adjusting his coat as he approached the porch. "James Forrester." He introduced himself, extending a hand that Silas deliberately did not take. "Representative of the Western Territories Development Company." "One of Hargrove's businesses." Silas observed neutrally, though his grip tightened imperceptibly on his rifle. If Forrester was surprised by this knowledge, he didn't show it. "Indeed," he confirmed smoothly. "Mr. Hargrove has extensive interests in this region. I'm conducting a survey of local settlements and outlying homesteads on his behalf." He produced a small notebook from his coat pocket. "Assessing population growth, land use, that sort of thing." "Is that so?" Silas kept his tone even, giving nothing away. "Seems like a long way to come just to count cabins." Forrester's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hargrove is thorough in his business dealings. He likes to know what resources are available in areas where he plans to expand." The emphasis on resources was subtle but unmistakable. Silas felt a cold anger building in his chest but kept his expression neutral. Behind Forrester, Jenkins shifted impatiently in his saddle, while Carter studied the ground, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Well, you've seen my place," Silas said flatly. "One cabin recently expanded, one man, one elderly Apache woman who helps with medicinal herbs and such." He gestured toward Tallulah, who had not looked up from her beadwork or given any indication that she understood the conversation. "Not much else to survey?" Forrester's gaze swept the clearing, lingering on the cabin's new addition, the garden plot freshly turned for spring planting, the second set of tracks leading away from the porch toward the creek. "I was given to understand," he said carefully, "that there might be another resident here, a younger woman, also Apache." "Was you now?" Silas's voice hardened slightly. "And who might have given you that understanding?" "Word travels," Forrester replied with a shrug. "Even in remote areas like this, I'm simply trying to be thorough in my survey." "My daughter is not here." Tallulah spoke suddenly in perfect English, causing all three visitors to start in surprise. She looked up from her beadwork, fixing Forrester with a penetrating stare. "She has gone to gather herbs in the hills. She will return when the moon is full." Forrester recovered quickly, though a flicker of unease crossed his face at Tallulah's steady gaze. "I see. And this daughter, she lives here as well." "Where else would she live?" Tallulah asked simply. "Our people are gone from these lands. The reservation is many days' journey to the west. Silas Sullivan offers shelter and protection in exchange for our knowledge of plants that heal. It is a fair arrangement." The simple explanation delivered with quiet dignity seemed to deflate some of the tension in the air. Carter nodded slightly as if the explanation confirmed what he had already suspected. Even Jenkins appeared somewhat mollified, though suspicion still clouded his features. Forrester, however, was not so easily deterred. "I've also heard," he said, his tone deliberately casual, "that this daughter of yours is with child. Is that correct?" Before Tallulah could answer, Silas rose to his feet, his movement deliberate enough to draw all eyes to the rifle still held loosely in his hands. "Mr. Forrester," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I've been patient with your questions out of respect for Mr. Carter here, but a woman's condition is her own private business, not something to be recorded in your little notebook for William Hargrove's curiosity." Forrester's face flushed slightly at the rebuke. "I assure you, Mr. Sullivan, my interest is purely professional. Mr. Hargrove is concerned about the welfare of all residents in areas where his company operates, particularly vulnerable populations." "Is that what we are now?" Silas asked with dangerous softness. "A vulnerable population. That's not what I—" "Let me make something clear," Silas interrupted, taking a step forward that caused Forrester to instinctively back away. "What happens on my land is my business. Who lives under my roof is my business. And anyone who comes here looking to cause trouble for me or mine will find more than they bargained for." He looked pointedly at Jenkins. "Isn't that right, Tom?" Jenkins, who had once made the mistake of trespassing on Silas's property to set traps without permission, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Man's entitled to his privacy," he muttered, surprising Silas with his support, reluctant though it was. "Indeed he is," Carter added, speaking for the first time. "And I believe we've imposed on Mr. Sullivan's hospitality long enough. James, you've seen what you came to see. Perhaps we should return to town before the day grows much warmer." Forrester looked like he wanted to press further, but thought better of it in the face of unified local resistance. "Of course," he said stiffly, returning his notebook to his pocket. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Sullivan, madam." He nodded toward Tallulah, who had returned to her beadwork as if the men no longer existed. As Forrester remounted his horse with awkward dignity, Carter lingered a moment. "Sullivan," he said quietly, "word of advice from an old man who's seen how things work out here. Whatever your arrangement with these women, keep it discreet. There are those in town who don't share my live and let live philosophy." "Appreciate the concern, Carter," Silas replied, "but I've never much cared for others' opinions of my business." The old storekeeper shrugged. "Your choice. But remember, Hargrove's company is bringing the railroad through these parts next year. Change is coming, whether we like it or not." He glanced at Tallulah. "Some types of change are harder on some folks than others." With that cryptic warning, he turned his horse and followed Forrester and Jenkins back down the trail, leaving Silas standing on the porch with a sense of unease that even the warm spring sunshine couldn't dispel. "Well," he asked Tallulah when the men were out of earshot, "what do you make of that?" The old woman set aside her beadwork, her expression grave. "Hargrove knows," she said simply. "He knows where we are and he knows about the child. This Forrester was sent to confirm what he had already been told." By whom, Silas wondered aloud. Who would have carried such specific information to Hargrove? "There are always those willing to sell information for the right price," Tallulah replied. "But it does not matter how he knows. What matters is what he will do with the knowledge." She looked up at Silas, her dark eyes reflecting the wisdom of her years. "He will come for the child, Silas Sullivan. Not himself, but men who do his bidding. They will come when the moon is full." The certainty in her voice sent a chill through Silas, despite the warm day. "Then we'll be ready for them or be them," he said grimly. "I won't let them take Ayana, Anna, or the baby." Tallulah nodded, rising slowly to her feet. "Yes," she agreed. "We will be ready, but first we must bring my daughter home. The cave is no place for a woman so close to her time." Together they walked the path to the creek, Silas automatically shortening his stride to match Tallulah's slower pace. The waterfall came into view, sparkling in the midday sun, giving no indication of the precious cargo it concealed. "Ayana," Tallulah called as they approached the narrow path that led behind the falling water. "They are gone. It is safe to return." For a moment there was no response. Then Ayana appeared at the cave entrance, one hand braced against the rock wall for support, the other cradling her swollen belly. Even from a distance, Silas could see that something was wrong. Her face was drawn with pain, her movements more labored than they had been just hours before. "Mother," she called, her voice tight. "The child, she is coming." Silas felt his heart drop. "Now, but you said, the child chooses her own time." Tallulah interrupted, already moving toward the cliff path with surprising speed for her age. The stress of hiding, perhaps, or simply that her moment has arrived. It does not matter why. What matters is that we must get Ayanna back to the cabin before the labor progresses too far. Silas quickly overtook Tallulah, scrambling along the narrow path with far less caution than usual in his haste to reach Ayanna. She met him at the cave entrance, her face pale but composed despite the pain evident in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said as he reached her. "I felt the first pains just after you left, but I thought they were false like the ones I had last week." "Don't apologize," Silas said, instinctively reaching for her hand. "Can you walk? I can carry you if needed." Ayanna managed a strained smile. "I can walk. It is better to move during the early stages." She squeezed his hand briefly before releasing it. "But I will need your support on the path. The rocks are slippery." With painstaking care, Silas helped Ayanna navigate the treacherous path along the cliff, with one arm around her waist, the other hand gripping the rock wall for balance. Tallulah followed close behind, murmuring encouragement in Apache. When they reached solid ground, Ayanna paused, bending slightly as another contraction gripped her. Silas held her steady, feeling helpless in the face of her pain, but determined to be whatever support she needed. "The pains come quickly," Tallulah observed when Ayanna straightened again. "The child is eager to greet the world." "Too eager," Ayanna said with a grimace. "She was supposed to wait for the full moon." "Perhaps she knows something we do not," Tallulah replied cryptically. "Come, we must reach the cabin before the next stage begins." The journey back seemed interminable, with frequent stops for Ayanna's increasingly powerful contractions. By the time they reached the clearing, she was leaning heavily on Silas, her breath coming in short gasps between pains. "Mike her to the new room," Tallulah instructed as they mounted the porch steps. "I have prepared it for this day." Inside, the small addition had indeed been arranged for childbirth. Fresh linens on the bed, a basin of water ready for heating, clean cloths stacked nearby, and various herbs and medicines laid out on the small table Silas had built for Tallulah's use. He helped Ayanna to the bed, where she sank down with a grateful sigh that quickly turned to a muffled groan as another contraction seized her. Tallulah moved with practiced efficiency, checking her daughter's condition with experienced hands. "The child comes quickly," she announced. "Perhaps too quickly. Silas, heat water and bring the blue jar from my shelf, the one with the star pattern on the lid." Silas hurried to comply, stoking the fire and setting the kettle to boil while searching among Tallulah's numerous containers for the one she had specified. His hands shook slightly as he worked, a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through him. This was not how they had planned it. Ayanna was supposed to have nearly 2 more weeks' time they had intended to use for final preparations and increased vigilance against Hargrove's men. Instead, the child had chosen today, the very day of Forrester's visit, to make her appearance in the world. The coincidence troubled Silas deeply, though he pushed the concern aside to focus on the immediate needs of mother and child. When he returned to the birthing room with the heated water and the blue jar, he found Ayanna sitting up in bed, her dress replaced by a simple cotton shift, her hair loose around her shoulders. Despite her obvious pain, she maintained a calm dignity that squeezed something in Silas's chest. "Silas," she said, reaching for his hand, as Tallulah mixed herbs from the jar into a cup of steaming water. "You should go. This is not a place for men in our tradition." "I'm not leaving you," he replied firmly, taking her outstretched hand. "Not today." Ayanna's eyes widened slightly at his vehemence, then softened with understanding. "Very well," she said, "but you have been warned childbirth is not a pretty sight." "I've seen worse," he assured her, earning a weak smile before another contraction claimed her attention. The hours that followed tested Silas's resolution many times over. Ayanna's labor progressed with frightening speed, her pain intensifying until she could no longer suppress her cries. Tallulah worked tirelessly, applying herbal compresses, monitoring the position of the child, murmuring encouragement in Apache. Silas found himself relegated to practical tasks, heating more water, bringing fresh cloths, supporting Ayanna's back when she needed to change positions. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Tallulah announced that the time had come. Ayana, exhausted but determined, braced herself for the final stage of labor. "The child is positioned well," Tallulah assured her. "But she is eager, too eager, perhaps. You must pace yourself, daughter. Do not push until I tell you." Ayana nodded, her face shining with sweat, her hands gripping Silas's with surprising strength. "Stay," she whispered to him as Tallulah arranged the birthing cloths. "Please. Wild horses couldn't drag me away," he promised, brushing damp hair from her forehead with his free hand. The next hour passed in a blur of intensity. Ayana's cries, Tallulah's calm instructions, the growing sense of a life poised on the threshold between worlds. Silas found himself praying for the first time in years, wordless entreaties to whatever power might be listening to protect this woman and the child she fought to bring into the world. And then, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, a new sound filled the cabin, the indignant wail of a newborn taking her first breath. Tallulah lifted the tiny squirming infant, quickly wiping fluid from her face and placing her on Ayana's chest. "A daughter," she announced, her voice thick with emotion. "Strong and perfect, as I saw in my vision." Ayana's exhaustion seemed to vanish as she gazed down at the child, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered, running a gentle finger over the baby's cheek. "Welcome to the world." Silas stood transfixed, overwhelmed by the miracle he had just witnessed. The child was indeed perfect. Tiny fingers flexing, dark eyes blinking in the soft lantern light, skin a shade lighter than her mother's, but with Ayana's delicate features already evident beneath the newborn roundness. "She's beautiful," he said hoarsely, surprised by the depth of emotion that threatened to choke him. "Just like her mother." Ayana looked up at him, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "Would you like to hold her once mother has cleaned and wrapped her?" The offer stunned him. In Apache tradition, as he understood it, newborns were generally kept within the circle of female relatives for the first days of life. That Ayana would offer him this honor. "I would be honored," he managed, his voice unsteady. Tallulah efficiently completed the birthing process, ensuring Ayana was stable and comfortable before taking the infant to clean and swaddle her in a soft blanket she had prepared months before. When she returned, she placed the now quiet bundle in Silas's arms with a solemn nod of approval. The weight of the child, so slight yet somehow immeasurably significant, nearly brought Silas to his knees. He cradled her carefully, marveling at the perfection of her tiny features, the surprising strength in her grip as she clutched his finger. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably within him, a final healing of the wound that had nearly destroyed him 5 years before. "What will you name her?" he asked softly, reluctantly returning the infant to Ayana's waiting arms. Mother and daughter exchanged a look laden with meaning. Then Ayana said, "Dawn. Her name is Dawn." She smiled at Silas's obvious surprise. "It came to me in a dream, a child born as darkness gave way to light, a bridge between worlds." She stroked the baby's cheek gently. "Dawn Sullivan." The addition of his surname rendered Silas momentarily speechless. "Ayana, I don't know what to say." "You have given us a home protection, a place to belong," she replied simply. "My daughter will carry your name as a mark of honor and gratitude." Her eyes held his steadily. "Unless you object." "No," he said quickly. "No objection. I'm honored beyond words." Tallulah, who had been quietly tidying the birthing space, paused in her work. "It is more than gratitude," she said, looking meaningfully at her daughter. "Tell him, Ayana, the time has come for truth between you." Ayana hesitated, glancing down at the now sleeping infant in her arms. "My mother is right," she said finally. "There is something you should know, Silas. Something I have suspected for some time, but could not bring myself to speak aloud." She took a deep breath. "Nathan Hargrove is not just any man of mixed blood. He is the son of William Hargrove, the man my mother says was responsible for the fire that took your wife and unborn child." Silas kept his expression carefully neutral, though inside his thoughts raced. So Ayana had known, or at least suspected, the connection all along. "Your mother told me," he admitted, "the morning after you arrived. She thought it best you not know until after the child was born." Surprise flickered across Ayana's face, followed by understanding. "That explains much about these past months, your determination to protect us, your reluctance to speak of your past." She gazed down at Dawn. This child carries the blood of both victim and perpetrator. A bridge indeed, though not one I would have chosen to build. The spirits work in ways we cannot always understand, Tallulah observed, returning to her task. But their purpose is revealed in time. Silas moved to sit beside Ayanna on the bed, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. How long have you known? He asked gently. I began to suspect when my mother first told me of your wife's death in a fire, Ayanna replied. It seemed too great a coincidence. Then when you reacted so strongly to Hargrove's name that night on the porch, she shrugged slightly. I did not know for certain, but I felt the connection between our stories. Why didn't you say anything? For the same reason you did not, I think, she said, meeting his gaze directly. To protect what was growing between us, this partnership, this understanding. She hesitated, then added softly, this family we have become. The simple statement, this family we have become, struck Silas with unexpected force. It was true, he realized. Somewhere in the months of shared work and purpose, of meals around the same table and conversations by the fire of preparations for the child and mutual protection against a common enemy, they had indeed become a family of sorts. Not conventional by any measure, not bound by blood or marriage, but a family nonetheless. Yes, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Family. Ayanna smiled tiredly, her eyelids beginning to droop as the exhaustion of labor caught up with her. Dawn needs a father, she murmured, her words slurring slightly with approaching sleep. A true father, not just a name. Before Silas could respond, her eyes closed completely, her breathing deepening into the rhythm of sleep. He sat beside her for a long moment, watching mother and daughter rest, his mind and heart too full for words. Tallulah approached quietly, laying a hand on his shoulder. Come, she said, let them sleep. We have much to prepare. Reluctantly, Silas followed her into the main room, closing the door softly behind them. The contrast was jarring, from the intimate, timeless space of birth to the practical concerns of the wider world. Hargrove's men will come, Tallulah said without preamble, moving to check that the cabin shutters were secured. Not tonight, they do not yet know the child has arrived. But soon, within days perhaps. Silas nodded grimly. Forrester will report back about our arrangement, and Hargrove will put the pieces together quickly enough. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly bone-weary, yet keenly alert to the dangers ahead. We need to be ready to move if necessary. The cave... No, Tallulah interrupted firmly. Ayanna cannot travel, not for at least a week. The birth was too swift, the strain on her body too great, and a newborn should not be exposed to the damp air of a cave. She fixed him with her penetrating stare. We must make our stand here, Silas Sullivan. This is where the vision has always led. The finality in her tone left no room for argument. Silas sighed, knowing she was right. Then we prepare the cabin for defense, he said. Barricade the windows, reinforce the doors, create firing positions. Yes, Tallulah agreed, and I will prepare what protections I can in my own way. At his questioning look, she added, not all strength comes from weapons, Silas. My people have other means of guarding what is precious to us. He didn't question her further, having learned over the months to respect the aspects of her beliefs that he didn't fully understand. Instead, he began a mental inventory of their resources, ammunition for his rifle, and the smaller pistol he kept for emergencies, food and water sufficient for several days' escape routes should the cabin become indefensible. How many will come? He asked, knowing Tallulah's visions often contain such details. 4, she replied without hesitation. Men who kill for payment, led by one who has a personal stake, Nathan Hargrove himself. Silas stared at her in surprise. Nathan, why would he lead an attack on his own child? To prove himself to his father, Tallulah said simply. William Hargrove was displeased when Nathan failed to persuade Ayanna to give up the child willingly. This is his chance to redeem himself in his father's eyes, to take by force what he could not obtain through deception. A cold anger settled in Silas's chest at the thought of Nathan Hargrove, who had already betrayed Ayanna, once returning to inflict further harm on her and the innocent child who now bore his blood. He'll have to kill me first, he said grimly. That is what he intends, Tallulah replied, her voice heavy with the weight of foresight. But intentions and outcomes are not always aligned, as you know well. She moved to the shelf where she kept her medicines, selecting several small pouches with careful deliberation. Rest now, Silas. Tomorrow we begin our preparations in earnest. The moon grows fuller each night, and with it our time grows shorter. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded Silas that night. He sat in the main room, rifle across his knees, listening to the soft sounds of mother and child from the adjoining chamber, his mind cycling through strategies and contingencies. The joy of Dawn's birth, the miracle he had witnessed, the unexpected honor of her bearing his name, warred with the grim knowledge that danger approached with each passing hour. William Hargrove had taken Margaret and their unborn child from him 5 years ago. Now his son Nathan sought to take Ayanna and Dawn to destroy another family before it had truly begun. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidence, too painful to be ignored. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the shuttered windows, Silas came to a decision. This time would be different. This time he would not be the passive victim of Hargrove's machinations. This time he would fight not just for survival, but for justice long deferred. And perhaps if fortune favored them, for a future he had never dared to imagine might be possible. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Silas worked tirelessly to fortify the cabin, reinforcing its shutters, creating defensive positions at windows, stockpiling water and supplies. Tallulah divided her time between caring for Ayanna and Dawn and preparing her own forms of protection, small pouches of herbs and symbols painted in natural pigments above doors and windows. Ayanna recovered quickly from the birth, her natural resilience asserting itself despite Tallulah's concerns. By the third day, she was up and moving about the cabin, Dawn cradled in a sling across her chest. The infant thrived, nursing vigorously and observing the world with dark, alert eyes that already seemed to hold a wisdom beyond her days. On the evening of the fourth day, with the moon now nearly full in the night sky, they gathered around the table for a simple meal. Dawn slept peacefully in the cradle Silas had built, while the adults spoke in low voices about the preparations still to be completed. Nathan will come from the north, Tallulah said with the certainty that accompanied her visions. Through the stand of dead pines, thinking to use them for cover. They will arrive at first light, believing to find us still asleep. Silas nodded, mentally adjusting his defensive plans to account for this information. I've set up an early warning system, tripwires with tin cans that will sound if disturbed. We'll have some advance notice. Good, Ayanna said, her hand unconsciously moving to check that the knife she now kept at her belt was secure. Despite Silas's protests, she had insisted on taking an active role in the defense of her child. What else can we do? Before Silas could respond, a soft cry came from the cradle. Ayanna rose immediately to attend to Dawn, lifting the infant with practiced gentleness and settling her to nurse. As she did so, a shaft of moonlight broke through the partially shuttered window, illuminating mother and child in a silvery glow that transformed them into something almost ethereal, a vision of beauty and vulnerability that tightened Silas's throat with emotion. In that moment of stillness, with Dawn nursing contentedly, Ayanna's face softened by maternal love, and Tallulah watching them both with quiet pride, Silas felt with sudden clarity what was truly at stake. Not just lives precious though they were, but the possibility of a future together. A family forged not through conventional bonds, but through shared purpose and growing affection. A chance at happiness he had thought forever lost in the ashes of his previous life. We could leave, he said abruptly, the words escaping before he had fully formed the thought. Tonight, while there's still time, head west toward the reservation lands where Hargrove has less influence. Ayanna looked up in surprise. Leave after all the preparations we've made? It was just a thought, Silas said, suddenly uncertain. A way to avoid confrontation, to keep Dawn safe. Running would not ensure her safety, Tallulah observed. It would only delay the inevitable. Hargrove's reach is long, his resources vast. There is nowhere in these territories where he could not eventually find us. And this is our home now, Ayanna added firmly. We have built something here, the three of us. Something worth defending. She met Silas's gaze directly. Unless you wish to be free of us, now that the child is born, your obligation could be considered fulfilled. No, Silas said immediately, the very thought filling him with dismay. That's not it at all. He struggled to articulate the fear that gripped him, not for himself, but for them. I couldn't bear to lose you. Either of you. His eyes moved to include Dawn in his statement. Any of you. The simple admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than any declaration of feeling might have been. Ayanna's expression softened, and something that might have been hope flickered in her eyes. "Then we stay," she said quietly. "We defend our home. Together." Tallulah nodded in agreement, a small smile playing about her lips as she observed the exchange between them. "The vision has always led to this moment," she said. "Not to flight, but to confrontation. To a choice that must be made, not avoided." Silas wanted to ask what choice she meant, but before he could, a sharp sound split the night, the metallic clatter of the warning system he had rigged along the northern approach to the cabin. All three adults froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Dawn, startled by the sudden tension, began to whimper. "They come early," Tallulah whispered, her expression grave. The vision was incomplete. Silas was already moving, retrieving his rifle from beside the door and checking that it was loaded. "Get to the back room," he instructed Ayanna. "Take Dawn and stay away from the windows." For once, she didn't argue, quickly wrapping Dawn in a blanket and retreating to the safer confines of the second chamber. Tallulah, however, remained seated at the table, seemingly unperturbed by the danger approaching. "You should go with them," Silas urged, peering through a small gap in the shutters toward the northern tree line. He could see nothing yet in the darkness, but the warning system didn't lie. Someone was out there. "My place is here," Tallulah replied calmly, "as it has always been." Before Silas could insist further, a voice called from the darkness outside, a voice that sent a chill through him with its cultured tones and underlying malice. "Sullivan, I know you're in there. Come out and let's discuss this like civilized men." Nathan Hargrove. Tallulah had been right about his leading the attack, if not about the timing. "Nothing to discuss, Hargrove," Silas called back, positioning himself carefully beside the window where he could see without being seen. "This is private property. You're trespassing." A laugh floated through the night air, confident, arrogant, utterly without warmth. "Private property? That's rich coming from a man harboring a fugitive Apache woman and her half-breed child." Silas's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, but he held his fire. Without a clear target, shooting would only waste ammunition they might desperately need later. "Ayanna isn't a fugitive," he replied steadily, "and the child is under my protection. My name. Go back to your father and tell him his scheme has failed." A brief silence followed this declaration, then Nathan's voice came again, closer now. "My father is a practical man, Sullivan. He's prepared to be generous. $500 for the woman and child delivered unharmed. That's more than most men out here see in a year." "Not interested," Silas answered flatly. "There's no price that would make me hand them over to you." "Don't be a fool," Nathan urged, his tone hardening. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. We can take them by force if necessary, and you'll get nothing but a bullet for your trouble." As if to emphasize the point, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wooden shutter inches from Silas's head. He ducked instinctively, then quickly repositioned himself at a different window. Now he could see them, four figures moving through the shadows at the edge of the clearing, just as Tallulah had predicted. Nathan appeared to be in the lead, his silhouette distinctive with its city-bred posture, while the others moved with the practiced stealth of men accustomed to violence. "That was your only warning," Silas called out. "The next man who fires on my home gets a bullet in return." Nathan's laugh floated through the darkness again. Big talk from a man who's spent 5 years hiding in the woods. "What's your plan, Sullivan?" "To die heroically defending an Indian woman who doesn't even belong to you. The child is mine by blood. By rights, I should be the one to determine her future." "You lost any right to that child when you abandoned her mother," Silas shot back, anger rising hot in his chest. "When you used Ayanna as a pawn in your father's land schemes." A brief silence followed this accusation, then Nathan's voice came again, closer still. "So you know about that, do you? I suppose the old witch told you? Well, it doesn't change anything. That child carries Hargrove blood, which gives her claim to lands my father needs. One way or another, she's coming with us." "Not while I live," Silas said simply. "That," Nathan replied, his voice now chillingly close to the porch, "can be arranged." The attack came swiftly. After that, a coordinated rush from multiple directions, bullets splintering wood as the hired guns attempted to suppress any return fire, while Nathan and another man made for the door. Silas fired twice in quick succession, rewarded by a cry of pain as one of the attackers fell. But the others kept coming, and he was forced to duck as a hail of bullets shattered the remaining intact windows. The door shuddered under a powerful impact, someone trying to break it down with brute force. Silas moved to reinforce it, but another volley of shots forced him back into cover. Silas, Ayana's voice came from the doorway to the second room. They're trying to come in through the back window. Before he could respond, the front door splintered inward, and Nathan Hargrove stood framed in the opening, a pistol in his hand and triumph in his eyes. Behind him, one of his hired guns provided covering fire, forcing Silas to stay behind the overturned table he was using for protection. "It's over, Sullivan," Nathan announced, stepping fully into the cabin. "Tell the woman to bring out my child, and perhaps I'll let you live." "That's not going to happen," Silas replied, calculating his chances of getting a clear shot before Nathan could fire. They weren't good, the angle was wrong, and the second gunman still had him pinned down. Nathan shrugged, his expression coldly indifferent. "Have it your way." He raised his pistol, aiming deliberately at Silas's position. "I never understood what Ayana saw in you anyway. A broken-down widower living in the middle of nowhere? What kind of life is that for a woman like her?" "A better one than being used and discarded by the likes of you," Silas retorted, trying to keep Nathan talking while he sought an opportunity to act. Nathan's face darkened at the barb. "You know nothing about what was between us," he said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Nothing at all." Before he could fire, a new voice entered the fray. Tallulah, who had remained seated at the table throughout the exchange, now rose to her feet with surprising agility for her age. "Nathan Hargrove," she said, her voice carrying an authority that caused both men to turn toward her. "Son of William, grandson of Elizabeth, Cherokee woman. You stand at a crossroads." Nathan's expression flickered with surprise at the mention of his Cherokee grandmother, a connection rarely acknowledged in public. "Stay out of this, old woman," he warned, though his pistol wavered slightly. "You cannot escape the blood that flows in your veins," Tallulah continued as if he hadn't spoken. "The same blood that flows in your daughter's veins. The blood of two worlds never fully belonging to either." She took a step towards him, seemingly unafraid of the weapon in his hand. "I have seen what becomes of you, Nathan Hargrove. I have seen the two paths that lie before you this night." A strange tension had entered the cabin, a hush that seemed to extend even to the men outside, as if nature itself were holding its breath to hear what came next. "In one path," Tallulah said, her voice taking on the cadence of prophecy, "you take the child by force. You deliver her to your father. You gain his momentary approval, perhaps even a share in his fortune. But the child grows knowing only hatred for the blood in her veins, your blood. She becomes the instrument of your destruction, and you die alone, despised by white and native alike, belonging nowhere, loved by no one." Nathan's face had paled, his pistol now hanging almost forgotten at his side. "And the other path?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the other," Tallulah replied. "You remember who you truly are, not just William Hargrove's son, but Elizabeth Cherokee woman's grandson. You choose your own way, not your father's. You help protect the child rather than steal her away. And in doing so, you find what you have sought all your life, a place to belong, a purpose worthy of your gifts." For a long moment, Nathan stood frozen, conflict evident in every line of his body. Then slowly he lowered his pistol completely. "You speak as if I have a choice," he said bitterly. "My father is not a man who accepts failure. If I return without the child—" "Then don't return to him," Silas said cautiously, rising from his defensive position, rifle still at the ready, but no longer aimed directly at Nathan. "Help us instead. Help us protect your daughter from becoming a pawn in William Hargrove's land schemes." Nathan laughed hollowly. "And how exactly would I do that? My father has resources you can't imagine, men, money, influence with territorial officials. He'll never stop coming for her." "Unless," Tallulah interjected, "he no longer has reason to want her." Both men turned to look at the old woman, who now wore an expression of quiet satisfaction, as if pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place. "What do you mean?" Nathan asked. "The papers," Tallulah said simply. "The documents that prove your father's illegal activities, bribing officials, falsifying land claims, arranging accidents for those who stood in his way." Her gaze shifted meaningfully to Silas, "including the fire that killed Margaret Sullivan and her unborn child." Nathan's shock appeared genuine. "What fire? What are you talking about?" In terse sentences, Silas explained his history with William Hargrove, his discovery of the fraudulent land dealings, his confrontation with the railroad magnate, and the fire that had followed 3 days later, claiming Margaret's life. "I knew my father was ruthless in business," Nathan said when Silas had finished, his face ashen. "But murder, I can't believe he would go that far." "Believe it," Silas said grimly. "I've had 5 years to think about the timing, to remember the threat he made when I confronted him. Go home to your pretty wife, Sullivan. Forget what you think you know if you want her to stay pretty." Those were his exact words. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, visibly shaken. "Even if what you say is true, what does it have to do with the papers Tallulah mentioned?" "What documents?" "The ones you have access to," Tallulah said calmly, "in your father's private safe. The records he keeps of all his dealings, both legal and otherwise. Insurance, he calls it, against those who might betray him." Nathan stared at her in disbelief. "How could you possibly know about that?" "The same way I know that you have considered taking those papers yourself," Tallulah replied, "using them to free yourself from your father's control. The same way I know that you have never stopped thinking about Ayanna, or the child you left growing in her womb." A complex series of emotions crossed Nathan's face: surprise, shame, a flash of something that might have been longing. "Even if I wanted to help you," he said finally, "my father's men are still out there. They have orders to take the child by any means necessary." As if on cue, a voice called from outside, "Mr. Hargrove, everything all right in there? We heard talking." Nathan hesitated, looking from Silas to Tallulah and back again. A moment of decision, just as the old woman had predicted, a crossroads with two paths stretching into very different futures. "Fine," he called back, his voice steady, despite the conflict evident in his eyes. "I'm negotiating with Sullivan. Hold your positions." Turning back to Silas, he lowered his voice. "I need to think. This is all happening too fast." "There's no time," Silas replied urgently. "Your men won't wait forever. You need to choose now. Help us protect your daughter or be the instrument of her captivity." At least let me see her," Nathan said, an edge of desperation entering his voice. "Before I decide, let me see the child." Silas exchanged a glance with Tallulah, who gave a small nod of approval. "Ayanna," he called softly. "It's all right, you can come out." After a moment's hesitation, Ayanna emerged from the back room, Dawn cradled protectively in her arms. She had dressed the infant in a simple white gown that Tallulah had made adorned with protective symbols embroidered in blue thread. Despite the danger surrounding them, the child slept peacefully, one tiny hand curled against her mother's chest. Nathan's breath caught audibly at the sight of them. Whatever he had expected, the reality of his daughter, this perfect innocent being who carried his blood yet owed nothing to his absence, clearly struck him with unexpected force. "She's beautiful," he whispered, taking an involuntary step forward before stopping himself, aware of Ayanna's wary posture. What did you name her?" "Dawn." Ayanna replied, her voice cool but not hostile. "Dawn Sullivan." Nathan flinched slightly at the surname, a flicker of something like jealousy crossing his features before being replaced by resignation. "Sullivan," he repeated softly. "I suppose that's fitting under the circumstances." A shout from outside interrupted the moment. "Mr. Hargrove, we're taking fire from the trees to the east. Someone else is out there." Nathan's head snapped up in alarm. "What? That's impossible. Who?" "The trappers," Silas realized suddenly. "Carter must have warned them about Forrester's visit. They're defending their territory against outsiders." It was a fortunate intervention, creating confusion among Nathan's hired guns and providing an unexpected opportunity. But it wouldn't last long once the gunmen realized they were being attacked by local trappers rather than reinforcements for Silas. They would press their advantage with renewed determination. "You need to decide," Silas urged Nathan. "Now, are you with us or against us?" Nathan looked once more at Dawn, sleeping innocently in her mother's arms, unaware of the momentous decisions being made around her decisions that would shape not only her future, but the futures of all present. Then his gaze shifted to Ayanna, whose face remained carefully neutral, despite the tension thrumming through her body. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said quietly. "After I left, my father, he threatened to disinherit me if I didn't return without you. Said I was throwing away everything for some Indian girl. But I couldn't bring myself to force you, not after." He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders with sudden resolve. "I can help you," he said, turning back to Silas. "Not just with these men, but with my father. I know where the papers are kept, all the evidence of his illegal dealings. With those documents, you could not only protect Dawn, but bring William Hargrove to justice for what he did to your wife. Why should we trust you? Ayanna asked, speaking directly to Nathan for the first time. You betrayed me once before. Nathan met her gaze steadily. Because despite everything, I do care what happens to our daughter. Because I'm tired of being my father's puppet. And because, he glanced at Tallulah, because the old woman is right. I've been standing at a crossroads my entire life, never fully belonging to either world. Maybe it's time I chose a path of my own. Outside, the gunfire had intensified. One of Nathan's men shouted in pain, suggesting the trappers had found their mark. The distraction wouldn't last much longer. A decision had to be made. All right, Silas said after a moment's consideration. We work together to get out of this immediate danger. Then we discuss next steps. He fixed Nathan with a hard stare. But understand this, Ayanna and Dawn stay here with me under my protection. Whatever help you provide, whatever path you choose going forward, that's non-negotiable. Nathan nodded slowly, a complex mixture of emotions playing across his face: regret, resignation, perhaps even a hint of relief at having the decision made for him. Agreed, he said. Now let's deal with my father's men before they regroup. What followed was a carefully coordinated counterattack, with Nathan calling his men inside under the pretense of having secured the cabin, only to have them disarmed by Silas the moment they entered. One tried to resist and received a rifle butt to the head for his trouble. The others, seeing their employer apparently switching sides, surrendered with little fight, mercenaries to the core, their loyalty extending only as far as their payment. By dawn, the immediate threat had been neutralized. The hired guns, bound and under guard by two of the local trappers who had come to Silas's aid, awaited transport to the territorial marshal in the settlement. Nathan, having proven his change of heart by helping to subdue his own men, sat at the cabin table with Silas, Ayanna, and Tallulah, plotting their next move against William Hargrove. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon, painting the clearing in shades of gold and rose. Dawn, both the time of day and the infant for whom it was named, had arrived, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. As the adults continued their discussion, their voices low but determined, the child slept peacefully in her cradle by the hearth. One tiny hand curled around the eagle feather that Tallulah had placed beside her as a talisman of protection. Above her, through the window that now stood open to the morning air, a patch of sky was visible, not the cold blue of winter or the changeable gray of early spring, but the deep, limitless azure of a perfect April day. Our sky, Silas thought, remembering Margaret's half-finished sampler, Our Home, and Ayanna's words about her father's belief that the Apache heart belonged not to the land, but to the sky that all people shared regardless of birth or blood. Our sky, our home, our family. Not what he had expected when he found an old woman dying in the snow 5 months ago. Not what he had planned when he built his solitary cabin 5 years ago in the aftermath of devastating loss. But perhaps, after all, exactly what he had been waiting for, without knowing it: a second chance at life, at purpose, at belonging. As if sensing his thoughts, Ayanna looked up from the discussion, her eyes meeting his across the table. In that shared glance was a wealth of unspoken understanding of trials endured and dangers faced, of trust slowly built and boundaries gradually crossed, of a future neither had imagined now unfolding before them with unexpected possibility. The road ahead would not be easy. William Hargrove remained a powerful enemy even with Nathan's defection and the evidence he promised to provide. The world beyond the cabin's walls was still fraught with prejudice and danger for a family like theirs, white Apache and mixed blood united under one roof. The challenges would be many, the obstacles significant. But as Silas returned Ayanna's gaze, as dawn stirred in her cradle with the first soft sounds of waking, as Tallulah nodded in quiet satisfaction at the scene before her, the vision she had followed for so long, finally realized, he felt a certainty settle in his heart. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as strangers thrown together by circumstance or necessity, but as a family forged in adversity and bound by something stronger than blood or convention, by choice, by respect, by a love that had grown slowly but surely through the long winter into this moment of spring awakening. All right, Silas said, returning his attention to the plan spread before them on the table. Here's what we do next. Outside, the day brightened. Inside, the future beckoned. And between them stretched the vast, limitless expanse of possibility, their sky, their home, their shared horizon. Together they stepped forward to meet it.